Chapter 2029. The Great Tao of Stars had a long history of accumulation and profound inheritance. In addition to the astronomical changes in the post-universe era, it was the right time for it to become an innate Great Tao. The right time, the right place, and the right people. The right time, the east wind of the era change. The right place, the reduction of the Great Tao of the five Grand Taos. The right people, Lu Xiaoyi's brilliant debut. This was the direction he focused on the most. For the second Great Tao, he chose the Great Tao of Equal Heaven. This was a Great Tao of Void. Sensing the scarcity of Great Tao of Void, he felt that there was a possibility of establishing a Tao in this aspect. Among the current 36 Great Taos, only impermanence and groundless existence were pure Void Taos. Impermanence focused on transformations, but there was no limit to them. Groundless existence created something out of nothing, and it lacked a sense of propriety. The innate Great Tao needed a rule that could provide balance between the Great Taos. Impartiality, each with its own emphasis. Not only did it affect the relationship between entities, but it also affected the relationship between humans and other creatures of cultivation. Actually, since the beginning of cultivation, humans had always been doing this. Towards mortals, other species, and nature, they all had the concept of balance. But just the concept alone wasn't enough. They also needed to establish a Tao as a rule. Before and after the change of the era, the competition between the various cultivation creatures would definitely become more intense. How to achieve balance among them was a huge problem. The Great Tao of Equal Heaven had the possibility of establishing a Tao. Wherever the trend went, all living things would grow, and the universe would be equal to the sky. The two Great Taos he chose, one real and one virtual, were coincidentally the nodes of the universe's change. It wasn't a wild thought that came to him on a whim. Establishing a Tao was a huge matter. It was the most direct, external manifestation of the change of the era. The internal mechanism. There wasn't a situation where every postnatal Great Tao had a chance. If you couldn't represent the new trend, new environment, and new era, what right did you have to establish an innate Great Tao? In the process of thinking about a new Great Tao, he had been hesitating whether to establish the Sword Tao as an innate Great Tao. As a swordsman, establishing a Tao was common sense. No one would criticize him, but he wasn't an arrogant person. He could think that his Sword Tao was unparalleled, but he wouldn't ask others to think so. He had to admit that the Sword Tao had its limitations. If the sword could establish a Tao, could the saber? What about the spear? What about the other items? Just because a swordsman's sword was the sharpest in his hands, did the cultivation world acknowledge it? Relatively speaking, Lu Xiaoyi valued the spirit attribute in the Sword Tao more. Not just a single sword. Since the beginning of the history of cultivation, the establishment of all the 36 connate Great Taos had complicated backstories, environmental influences, and people's feelings. It wasn't that the heavenly Tao thought that this Tao was an innate Tao. It was an innate Tao. A portion of the heavenly Tao's judgment came from the billions of living beings in the cultivation world. In other words, any connate Great Tao had to be acknowledged by the majority of the cultivators. This was also a basic condition for achieving the Tao. Did the way of the sword have such a broad foundation of cultivation? He expressed his doubts. It had to be admitted that because of its sharpness, the sword vein had more enemies than friends in the cultivation world of the universe. Even if there were allies and partners, those were only for the sake of benefits, not because they truly recognized the sword vein. Thinking back to when the Crow ancestor set up the Great Tao tablet in the Heaven's Choice continent, it was actually for the inheritance of the Sword Tao. He relied on Tao De to become an immortal, not the Sword Tao. After becoming an immortal, he did three things: feeding Qin Kong, releasing the Fox clan, and forcing Tao De to descend to the lower realm. However, he didn't take the opportunity to establish the Tao for the Sword Tao. It wasn't that he didn't want to do it, but that he couldn't. If he really did that, He would be criticized by everyone in the cultivation world of the universe. He would be criticized for being selfish, and he wouldn't even be able to achieve the current situation. Whether the Xianyuan sword vein could survive for 20,000 years after he left was a problem. Lu Xiaoyi had the same considerations. Perhaps the spirit of drawing the sword was more likely. It wasn't just against the enemy, but also to explore nature and challenge oneself, and to say no to injustice. There were too many things to say, and he couldn't understand it in such a short time. Spirit-related great Daos were often more difficult than physical great Daos, because there was no reference, no phenomenon. It was purely illusory and too brain-burning. A new great Dao was relative to the original 36 innate great Daos. It didn't mean that one had to create a completely new great Dao that no one had ever heard of before. These were two different concepts. In fact, it was almost impossible for a completely new great Dao to appear, because this was an insult to the millions of years of history of the cultivation world. The direction of the hard work of trillions of cultivators over the long years. What else could they not think of? The reason why the Heaven's Choice continent was so popular was not only because there were still 20 innate great Daos there, but also because there were thousands of post-celestial great Daos. Who could be sure that there weren't any new great Daos there? For example, Lu Xiaoyi's Star Great Dao and Sword Dao had steals in the Heaven's Choice continent. To put it bluntly, it was picking up other people's ideas. However, to be able to turn the scraps of other people's ideas into toothpick meat that truly belonged to oneself, fusing with new things, matching the general trend of the universe, and showing off a new height. This was ability. It wasn't just him. In fact, every half-immortal was doing this. This even included those sun gods who were risking their lives. There were also many famous great Daos among the post-celestial great Daos that were sought after and listed as one of the most promising innate great Daos. For example, Pure Yang, Yin Kuei, Blood River, Circumference, Seven Planets, Netherworld, Hidden Treasure, Dark Night, Light, Divergence, Great Dan, and so on. There were many ambitious people who were researching and trying to take advantage of the change of era to establish the foundation of innate great Daos. Of course, there were definitely those who were ambitious and created their own great Daos. For example, Lu Xiaoyi's Dao of equalization. However, this was a cultivator's personal secret. No one would easily reveal it to others until the last moment. He was looking forward to the moment when the great Daos were decided. Would they be announced one by one in advance, or would all the qualified great Daos gather together to fight it out? He estimated that it was the latter. He felt that the heavenly Dao wouldn't reveal the mystery until the last moment. This way, at least the chaos would be concentrated in one place, in a period, and not a long struggle to decide the great Daos. That would be a real big scene. Compared to such a scene, the so-called universe war between realms wasn't worth mentioning. It was not a scene that human beings or cultivators could come up with schemes and tricks. At that time, the outstanding talents inside and outside, the elites of the half-immortals, the representatives of the immortals, the experts who lived in seclusion, the experts who lived outside the world, the ancient demonic beasts, the true bodies of the numinous treasures. No one could stay out of it and stay out of it. These great Daos between each other and the original 36 innate great Daos would launch a struggle. The era changed, the world was overturned, and the established great Daos would also determine the immortals. Just thinking about it was exciting. Chapter 2030. The prospect of the future made Lu Xiaoyi a little excited. This kind of Dao battle was in line with his understanding of cultivation. There was a limit to human strength, and the rest was up to fate. To Lu Xiaoyi, he had never thought of completely controlling the rise and fall of the connate great Dao. He only hoped that he could make a small contribution to it. If he did too much, his brain wouldn't be enough. At least one, preferably two new connate great Daos. This was the small goal he set for himself. He thought and acted as he flew. It was a leisurely and happy journey. There were very few people along the way. The Heavenly Fox clan was a taboo even in the southern mammoth sky, which was the most powerful among the four mammoths. In fact, in the entire beast clan, the intricate and complicated relationships often baffled human cultivators. It was very difficult to give a strict system to accurately define them. In theory, the primordial beasts were the most respected among the beast clan. However, there was a sudden appearance of a strange beast. In the eyes of humans, some people put the strange beasts and the primordial beasts on the same level because their abilities were comparable. However, there was also a school of thought that did not classify the strange beasts as beasts because they were born and bred and could not reproduce. They were more inclined to classify the strange beasts as spiritual treasures. In this way, it seemed that the status of ordinary beasts was lower, only slightly higher than a void beast, which was a creature with low intelligence. However, what was strange was that among the ordinary beasts, there were heavenly foxes, a race with superior intelligence that was not inferior to humans. There were even some beasts that did not treat the heavenly foxes as fellow beasts, but as humans. This showed how different this race was. Of course, it also indirectly said that the heavenly foxes' lifestyle and cultivation habits were similar to that of humans. They were the only race that could learn human cultivation methods in addition to their own race's supernatural powers. This was not an individual behavior, but the behavior of the entire race. They were also the only race of beasts that could truly understand human civilization. For example, they liked music, chess, calligraphy, and painting from the bottom of their hearts. This characteristic made them very hurt in the cultivation world. The human cultivation world did not accept them, and their fellow beasts ostracized them. In addition, they made some mistakes long ago. As a result, they were imprisoned in the exterior sky for millions of years. Even if they were released back to the main world, they could not return home. This was the tragedy of the heavenly fox, a creature that yearned for a human's way of life and cultivation, but was rejected by all the other species. Lu Xiaoyi had read the Crow ancestor's comment on the Celestial Fox clan in his autobiography. Ultimately, when humans see another race that is not inferior to humans in terms of intelligence, the most natural reaction of humans is to destroy them. Even if the difficulties in reproduction made it impossible for them to become the dominant species, humans were still afraid. The Crow ancestor's autobiography was something that only the higher-ups of Xianyuan had access to. It was also something that Lu Xiaoyi had read when he stopped at the dome. To be honest, the autobiography was filled with self-aggrandizement and self-praise. However, Lu Xiaoyi still believed the Crow ancestor's evaluation of the heavenly fox. The characteristic of this ancestor was that whenever he talked about others, he would talk about himself in a way that was extremely profound. If this wasn't an autobiography, then he was bragging. He was a very cynical person who didn't care about the world at all. With just a glance, one could tell that he wasn't reliable. This was actually the Crow ancestor's style. He didn't care about what others thought. It was fine as long as he was happy. It was even better if he disgusted others. In the autobiography, the Crow ancestor shamelessly hinted that he had countless lovers in the Heavenly Fox clan, and how he was a playboy, and how he charmed the other Heavenly Foxes. However, Lu Xiaoyi had seen through this ancestor. When he bragged the most, it was actually to cover up the fact that he didn't succeed. The point was that he didn't succeed. In other words, the Crow ancestor didn't lend a helping hand to the Heavenly Fox clan because of the matter under his navel. He must have another purpose. The rumor about him having an affair with the beautiful Heavenly Fox was just a cover. What was it? He didn't know. Therefore, he had to make a trip there. The Crow ancestor was a powerful swordsman. His advice and guidance to those who came after him wouldn't just be on the surface. Otherwise, those guys on the dome who regarded him as a god would die one by one in such a mission sooner or later. He needed an equally powerful, meticulous, ruthless, and shameless person to have the qualification to try. As far as he was concerned, except for Lu Xiaoyi, no one else could do it. It seemed very mysterious. a little secret that had been hidden for more than 20,000 years. However, Lu Xiaoyi was not interested in it. His pride would not stop at the level of wiping someone's ass, nor would he be excited by such a secret. It was as if as long as he found out the truth in the end, everything would become smooth sailing. He had his plan, his judgment, his plan, his ambition, his persistence, his everything. None of this would change because of others. Even if it was the Crow ancestor. Even if it was the Crow ancestor who instigated the revolution of the universe. So what? You started it, but it's up to me to decide the result. Young Master Lu could do whatever he wanted. He could do whatever he liked. You die, I live. That's the difference. Relatively speaking, he was more concerned about the Crow ancestor's unfinished business in the Heavenly Fox clan. He felt that he was more interested in this aspect. This was the boundless sea and sky he had after choosing to become the young master of Lu Province. He didn't need to worry about anyone or be tied down by anyone. Even if it was the Crow ancestor's past, he could wipe it if he wanted to. If he didn't want to, he could not wipe it. Only in this way could he really throw away his arms and do things according to his own wishes. Because he had always been very clear that according to the Crow ancestor's way, he could not achieve great things. A trip to the Forest Fox path still involved many aspects behind it. The outside world, the internal world, and his own. This was the environment he was working in now. Only by carrying a simple burden himself could he go further. Time quietly flowed by as his soul traveled through the universe. Soon, the greater half of his 20-year journey had passed. The next part of the universe was the location of the hidden Forest Fox path. And it was at this time that he discovered traces of human cultivators. The four symbols of the universe seemed to have their own emphasis. The East Heaven Taoist, the West Heaven Buddhism, the North Heaven Spirit Treasures, and the South Heaven Demon Beasts. It was not that the North Heaven Spirit Treasures were everywhere, but in the South Heaven Demon Beasts were rampant. However, relatively speaking, the North Heaven Spirit Treasures existed more than the other three heavens. In the South Heaven, the proportion of demon beasts was slightly higher than normal. But in any case, in the four symbols of the universe, humans were the real protagonists. It was just that in the South Heaven, demon beasts had more say. Therefore, it was not surprising to see humans instead of demon beasts. For places like the Forest Fox path, demon beasts were not willing to be contaminated. They did not like the personality of the spirit celestial phenomenon. Only human cultivators dared to go as long as there were benefits. Chapter 2031. This was a group of Kuan cultivators. Those heading toward the Forest Fox path were basically all Kuan cultivators. The reason was simple. The Heavenly Fox race was a typical matriarchal race. The seven-tailed and eight-tailed Heavenly Foxes were basically all female. The specific reason was unknown, but this was not a very special case among the universe's cultivation creatures. In the classification of species, male demons were undoubtedly more dominant. Since there was such a characteristic, the Forest Fox path spiritual illusion, celestial phenomenon treated cultivators of different genders differently. Simply put, it was very dangerous for a Kuan cultivator to enter, but it was much better for a Kuan cultivator. Generally, there was no possibility of them getting lost in there forever. Lu Xiaoyi had also talked to old Taoist Wen Ji about the strangeness of this place. According to the old man, it was very likely that the Forest Fox path in the main world was a place where Een flowers were naturally abundant. That was why the first ancestor of the Heavenly Foxes had risen here. That was why there was a matriarchal structure and the spiritual illusion, celestial phenomenon was produced. Therefore, this place was actually a very high-end place for the southern heavenly Kuan cultivators to train their spiritual power. Of course, not just anyone could enter. At the very least, one had to be a perfected lord. If one wanted to be safer, one had to be a primordial spirit or yang spirit to have the confidence to come here to train their spiritual power and not to court death. Lu Xiaoyi had met such a group of Kuan cultivators. Clearly, they had come in a group. Otherwise, there would not be such a powerful domain in the nearby space that could gather so many high-level Kuin cultivators at once. Why did they form a group? Was it more convenient to enter and exit the forest fox path? Or was it safer to travel on the road? He was not too sure, and it had nothing to do with him. There was an overlap in the flight route, and he did not deliberately avoid it. However, he did not think of provoking them either. Yes, he chose to focus on the heavenly foxes, who were said to be unparalleled in beauty. But he saw that the Kuin cultivators were indifferent, and the Kuin cultivators looked at him strangely. In the dozens of nearby universes, the forest fox path's variability was not a secret. After a million years, there was basically no high-level cultivator in the entire southern heavenly continent who did not know about it. It was a very important taboo for great cultivators to travel the universe. This group of Kuin cultivators was led by an essence soul-perfected lord and a yang spirit. When their tracks overlapped with Lu Xiaoi's and they traveled together for a period of time, the Kuin cultivators roughly determined the direction he was heading in. It was definitely the forest fox path. An essence soul divine consciousness reminded him, "Fellow Taoist, where are you from? If we go to the hidden forest fox path, there will be many inconveniences. Has fellow Taoist heard of this?" Lu Xiaoi replied politely, "I've heard a little about it, but when you're in the universe, you have no choice. Even if it's dangerous, you can only go. Thank you for your reminder, senior sisters. I appreciate it." His answer was courteous, but the problem wasn't that simple. The nascent soul cultivator continued, "I've heard a little about it, but that's not enough. In the past 1,000 years, the southern elephant heavens have reached a consensus on how to enter the forest fox path. There are some new rules that you probably don't know about, right?" This primordial spirit Kuin cultivator spoke in a rather secretive manner, hinting at a lot of things. However, after a few conversations, Lu Xiaoi, who was an astute person, understood what she meant tacitly. To be honest, it made him speechless. The forest fox path had different natures. This wasn't a big deal for a Yin-Chi celestial phenomenon. In the universe, there were similar special environments everywhere. They were very picky about the cultivators. They were picky about their orthodoxies, races, realms, and of course, gender. There were many places that pure Yang realm cultivators and Kuin cultivators weren't suitable to enter. If they weren't so narrow-minded and treated this place as a spiritual cultivation, holy ground that only belonged to Kuin cultivators, they wouldn't feel so disappointed. There were places that Qian cultivators couldn't enter, but there were even more places that Kuin cultivators didn't dare to enter. Everyone knew that the hidden path of the forest fox was a spiritual illusion, celestial phenomenon. When the heavenly fox clan was still around, they could control such a spiritual illusion, celestial phenomenon to a certain extent. There was a limit to who they could harass, who they attacked, what method they used, and what degree they could achieve. However, after the heavenly foxes left for 1,000,000 years, no one could control this celestial phenomenon anymore. Slowly, the creation and influence of the illusion returned to nature and moved according to the celestial phenomenon's internal mechanism. In other words, it was out of the range of human control. However, suppressing the universe was still the main theme. This was determined by the nature of the forest fox celestial phenomenon and could never be changed, unless the Yin-Chi celestial phenomenon's Tao realm cultivator was gone. For tens of thousands of years, the southern elephant heavens celestial phenomenon cultivators had slowly gotten used to the fact that they were controlled by nature. To be honest, wasn't much different from when the heavenly foxes were around. However, in the recent few thousand years, the forest fox celestial phenomenon had started to change quietly. This was very normal. Almost all the celestial phenomena in this universe were changing. It was only a matter of how much and how strong they were. The universe changed, the epoch changed, and the 5 essences collapsed. Change was the main theme. However, the changes in the forest fox path made people speechless. Originally, in the celestial phenomenon illusory realm, if many people came, they would enter different scenes of the illusion and play their own game without interfering with each other. Now, under the changes, the forest fox celestial phenomenon illusory realm started to develop from a one-man show to a stage play. It started to gather cultivators together to display the illusion. Was it better to enjoy it together than to enjoy it alone? If everyone was a Kuan cultivator, it wouldn't matter if they gathered together to cultivate in the spiritual illusion. However, if a male cultivator sneaked in, it seemed that the forest fox path had become especially strange in this aspect recently. As long as a Kuan cultivator entered, they would immediately be paired up, one-on-one, or a couple. They would be thrown into the celestial phenomenon illusory realm, and something would happen between them. This situation made the Kuan cultivators feel very awkward. As the changes in the celestial phenomenon in the universe became more and more intense, the epic change was approaching. This strange phenomenon wasn't unique to the forest fox path. They had also heard that the pure yang realm actually allowed Kuan cultivators to enter. Moreover, like the forest fox, it liked to group cultivators from different universes together. Had it become a large-scale matchmaking scene? It sounded ridiculous, but if one thought about it carefully, it wasn't without reason. The universe was changing, yin and yang were combining. Alone yin wouldn't give birth, alone yang wouldn't last. Before the long cycle of this epoch came to an end, the great Tao would begin to balance out. It was also because of this change in the forest fox realm that the Kuan cultivators of the Southern Elephant Heaven felt very awkward. They sent letters to the Southern Elephant Heaven, urging the Kuan cultivators of the Southern Elephant Heaven to try their best not to go to the forest fox path, to cultivate in order to avoid embarrassing everyone. The strength of the women was still very strong. Furthermore, the forest fox path wasn't the only place in the universe to cultivate in the spirit. Therefore, the Kuan cultivators of the large worlds could basically abide by this suggestion. They knew what was important and what was important. They knew that if they forced their way in and angered the Kuan cultivators, the forest fox illusory realm, which was already very dangerous for Kuan cultivators, would become even more dangerous. They might as well not go. It would be good and they would be safe. However, in the universe, there would always be people who didn't listen to advice. Small factions, sects, itinerant cultivators, or cultivators from other mammoth heavens. Chapter 2032. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi would not listen to their advice. His time was very precious. This group of Kuan cultivators came to Linghu for an indefinite amount of time. It could take 10 years or even 100 years. He could not afford to wait. They still treated him with respect. Everyone had their reasons. This was the cultivation world. There was no right or wrong. I do have a reason to enter. If I'm really trapped in the illusion, I will follow the rules and not cross the line. Senior sisters, don't worry. I'm not a rash person. The Kuan cultivators stopped trying to persuade him. To them, they were just fulfilling their duty. Knowing the dangers of Linghu's secluded path, but still insisting on coming was basically impossible for an essence soul perfected lord to listen to their advice. Especially in the current period of the universe's changes, taking risks and even risking everything had become the norm for cultivators. It was even more so for an essence soul perfected lord. If they gave it their all, there was still the possibility of catching up with the change of eras. Who would be willing to give up? Sit back and watch. 9 out of 10 of them would not hesitate to take the risk. They had their own ways to deal with such people. Everyone had seen in Linghu's secluded path, and there was no pity to speak of. They traveled in silence for a few years. Even if both parties maintained the same path, there was no communication. To Lu Xiaoyi, his current status was not suitable for him to fool around. He was now the best friend of women and needed to consider his own status. The Kuan cultivators had no intention of getting involved. Whether he really had something to do or was just trying to fish in troubled waters, there's not much difference. No one was more familiar with Linghu's secluded path's illusion than them. They had many ways to make him sink into it forever. Of course, it still depended on this fellow's performance. A few years later, Lu Xiaoyi began to feel an inexplicable fluctuation of spiritual energy. This was the first feeling he had when he entered this universe. It made him instantly understand that the Linghu secluded path was not limited to Linghu secluded path. It was caused by the environment of the entire universe. Illusions and dreams were two completely different things. However, if one looked at the mechanism in detail, there were similarities under the stimulation of the cerebral cortex. The difference was that the dream had a process of pulling people into it. It could be pulled into one's own dream or into someone else's dream. No matter which one it was related to the cultivator's past. The background of the dream had to have happened in the past. If not, it could not cause harm to the opponent. It was pure consciousness entering the dream. The body would not enter. Illusions, on the other hand, were different. They were replicas of the layout of the scene using spiritual energy. It was a situation where both the body and the mind were involved. However, in such a scene, the mind of the cultivator would be greatly affected and misled. They would often treat things that were not real as real and do many strange things as a result. The forest fox hidden realm should be the latter, or a combination of illusions and dreams. This kind of illusion was the highest level of interference to a cultivator's consciousness. No cultivator could completely break free from it. The only difference was how much they fell into it. If one was powerful, had unparalleled mental energy, and had some understanding of the consciousness illusion, the effect would not be great. However, if one did not have these conditions, it was possible for one to be obsessed in the illusion and not know when one would wake up, or even never wake up. This journey in the illusion had actually started when he entered this universe. Lu Xiaoyi was able to keenly discover this point thanks to the discussion between the stone anchor beast and the wall of illumination. No matter what method it was, whether it was a dream or an illusion, it would still cause changes in his cerebral cortex consciousness through some kind of power. This was something that could not be avoided. The protection of the memories of the present world had already been put on the agenda after the discussion with the stone anchor beast. This was not a difficult operation, and there was no secret technique. When one understood the internal mechanism of the formation of the dream, as a half-immortal cultivator, of course, one would understand how to protect one's cerebral memories. It was nothing more than a kind of spiritual application. There were too many ways. He was guarding against the dream, but he did not expect that the harvest of the mirror would be the first to be applied to the illusion. It was really the case that the east was not bright, but the west was bright. Entering the realm had actually started from the moment he entered this universe. He didn't know if those Kuan cultivators could sense it, or if they were on guard, but he had indeed sensed it. No one could warn him of this. Only that extremely slight mental disturbance in the form of energy was constantly gently stroking his cerebral cortex and consciousness. Only then did he sense it. In this kind of spiritual power contest, he did not know what the orthodoxies who were proficient in dreams and illusions would explain this phenomenon, so he could only distinguish it through his own understanding. The stone anchor beast could not explain anything. It could not explain its own divine ability, so it could only demonstrate it to Lu Xiaoyi and let him judge it from human's perspective. The cerebral cortex consciousness was a concept that belonged to Lu Xiaoyi alone. This might also be related to a part of his past that he had abandoned. The past was abandoned, but the knowledge of the past was not. This was also a very interesting thing. At the moment, this kind of spiritual energy that belonged to this universe was using this kind of gentle touch to make him feel happy, relaxed, and comfortable. Then, he would have a good impression of the forest fox path that he was about to reach and let his guard down. It was like a happy outing. Lu Xiaoyi confirmed it again and again. The method was to give up the protection of his cerebral cortex for a period of time, and then quietly feel the changes in his mood. After a period of time, he would regain the protection and then carefully experience the process of changing from pleasure to calmness. It could be said that this kind of spiritual touch was completely harmless and without any purpose. But if this continued for a long time, when you were close to the forest fox path, you who had been happy for a period of time might have a sudden change in your mood. Not happiness, but worship. It was like dating. Of course, at the beginning, it was impossible to love the other person to death. It would always start with a faint good impression, and then through various scenes and contact, this impression would deepen through time. In the end, you would fall into a quagmire and be unable to extricate yourself from it. This was probably the feeling. The forest fox path, this spiritual astronomical phenomenon, used this kind of method to begin to let your guard down against cultivation creatures from a long distance away. It allowed you to completely adapt to this kind of warm, spiritual touch and unknowingly fall into its illusion. Therefore, even if cultivators still did not feel any abnormalities in the illusion, they were already in the illusion. This was a very clever way of mental transition. Lu Xiaoyi felt it. It was not only because of his sensitivity as a half-immortal, but also because of the stone anchor beast's help. Under this kind of gentle spiritual touch, their group finally arrived near the forest fox path. In terms of mood, he was neither worried nor happy, and maintained an appropriate level of happiness. This was a kind of precaution. He was afraid that if he was too clear-headed, he would lose the qualification to enter the forest fox path or attract the special attention of this spiritual astronomical phenomenon. In contrast, those earth cultivators were very happy, as if this was their home. Chapter 2033. This was an exceptionally beautiful cloud of star fog. It did not have a physical body and was more like a large gaseous haze. Because it did not have a physical body, it was unusually huge. Different light spectrums in the universe shone over, and when they passed through this cloud of star fog, they reflected colorful lights. It was more dazzling than the most beautiful gem in the world. Based on visual estimation, this cloud of star fog could prevent a cultivator from flying through it for several months. This also meant that as long as the illusion was slightly tampered with, the cultivator would not be able to fly out for the rest of his life. Since the spiritual phenomenon could affect a cultivator's mood and perception, it could also affect a cultivator's sense of direction. Lu Xiaoyi stood outside the cloud of star fog and stared at it for a long time. He did not know what was waiting for him inside. His purpose here was very vague. He was looking for the mysterious connection with a macho path. This was not looking for an object. There was no object at all. It was just looking for a feeling. And feelings were the most illusory things. Among the group of earth cultivators, the young god who led the group covered him with her divine sense. I'm Hua Shun. Have you heard of me? Lu Xiaoyi blushed with shame. I've heard a lot about you. Hua Shun understood immediately. Her position in the southern elephant heaven was special. There was no major cultivator who had not heard of her. So, you're not from the southern elephant heaven? Well, it's usually you outsiders who are stubborn in the forest fox path. I'll just say one thing. The forest fox illusion looks peaceful and beautiful, but it's actually dangerous. In the illusion, self-preservation is instinctive. We southern elephant earth cultivators also have our own unique methods. If you insist on going in, don't blame us for targeting you. That's an illusion. It can't be as peaceful as usual. Do you understand? Lu Xiaoyi smiled and nodded. This young Shenkuan cultivator was very honest. She probably had some reputation in the southern elephant heaven. Lu Xiaoyi, who was in the immortal soul stage, did not recognize her. Naturally, he knew that she was not from the southern elephant heaven. Her meaning was very clear. After entering the illusion, he might not be himself. Some thoughts, some scenes, some coincidences often made cultivators do things they would not do under normal circumstances. Under such circumstances, self-preservation was the only choice. Everything else was secondary. An outsider like Lu Xiaoyi was likely to become their target, no matter what method they used, whether it was fighting or something else. Lu Xiaoyi guessed that some other method was more likely. After all, this was not an arena, but an illusion. It was a scene that released the evil in the hearts of humans to the greatest extent. However, he also said, "Thank you for your reminder, fellow Taoist Hua. I've come from far, so it's not good for me to give up. If I've really brought any trouble to you in the illusionary realm, please forgive me." He hoped that he would have a chance to apologize when he came out. However, There is one thing I don't understand. The forest fox hidden path is right here. I might not be the only Chinchou to enter, right? For example, was there anyone inside? Would there be others after that? Huashan sighed. I only know that cultivators from the southern phenomenon heavens won't come here easily. As for cultivators from the other phenomenon heavens, we can't control them. For example, you, fellow Taoist. For us, it's the same treatment. It's hard for us to distinguish who is who in the illusion. So, Lu Xiaoyi said with a smile, I understand, but I hope I'm not the unluckiest one. The Kuan cultivators filed in. They didn't have any psychological barriers to the forest fox hidden path. This was also the best place to cultivate to improve one's spiritual power. Lu Xiaoyi was gifted in spiritual power ever since he started cultivating. He also had his own unique method, but not every cultivator had this kind of ability. Most people were mentally stretched. This was the great hurdle to deal with the changes in the universe, which was why this place was so popular. Lu Xiaoyi saw the Kuan cultivators enter together and waited outside for a few days. He didn't know if this could separate him from the Kuan cultivators in different illusionary realms. He was here to find the path of Macho. He wasn't in the mood to hunt for beauties here. He carefully weighed the protection of his cerebral cortex. He needed to achieve a balance. He wouldn't be completely confused by the illusion, but he also didn't need to be completely awake. He knew that he couldn't forcefully resist such a huge spirit astronomical body. Therefore, he couldn't let this spiritual power here realize how difficult it was to deal with him. After a few days, his figure flashed and disappeared into the dense star fog. A large ship was sailing in the turbulent sea. This was the route from the Moon Crescent Archipelago to the central continent. In this world, it was also the most dangerous route. Only the most experienced seafarers dared to take this route. Of course, there was no lack of expensive transportation fees. The entire voyage was close to a year. In this desolate world, it was a voyage that most people couldn't experience in their lifetime. The entire ship had more than 100 people. Among them, there were dozens of crew members, dozens of travelers, and countless goods. In this world, the ocean was the base color. In the center was a continent, and around it were countless islands of various sizes scattered like stars in the sky. The central continent in the center was the core of human civilization. Every archipelago took the central continent as an example. They learned their writing, art, advanced civilization, and perfect system. From small crops to large machinery, there was nothing they didn't learn. However, because the ocean was too vast, it was inconvenient to pass through. Therefore, those who were close to the central continent had the advantage of being in a favorable position. Their level of development was the closest to the central continent. Those who were further away couldn't bear it. Under the obstruction of nature, it also prevented the spread of civilization. The Moon Crescent Archipelago was the outermost island group in this world. Because it was too far away, even regular merchant ships came and went intermittently. Very few ships dared to take this route. Although the rewards were generous, if they had to exchange their lives for it, there weren't many people who were willing. The completion rate of this route didn't even exceed 30%. It was a true journey of death. However, no matter how dangerous it was, there were occasionally people who were willing to take risks. For example, this time, the Central Continent Emperor's 100-year birthday. Of course, all the islands had to come and celebrate. This was a matter of attitude and couldn't be neglected. Therefore, the Moon Crescent Archipelago invited the best ship captain to complete this trip. Not only were there the most precious specialties of the Moon Crescent Archipelago, there were also the most beautiful dancers. Bearing the respect of the Moon Crescent Archipelago, they set off towards the central continent. This voyage was calm when they first left the Moon Crescent Archipelago, but this was just an illusion. 3 months later, they would enter the most dangerous ghost sea domain. This place was covered with bright and dark reefs, turbulent currents, and dark ditches. It was the most dangerous sea domain in this world. They would have to travel here for half a year before reaching a relatively safe sea domain, which was also the outer sea of the central continent. Right now, This large ship had just sailed for 3 months. Tomorrow, they would officially enter the ghost sea domain. This was also the true test of their voyage. Chapter 2034. See, Rabbit, it's your turn. A rough voice rang out, echoing throughout the ship. Firstly, the voice was loud enough, and secondly, the voice came from a lookout at the highest point of the ship. There were many key factors when sailing on the sea, such as an experienced captain, a skilled helmsman, a strong sailor, a strong first mate, and so on. Among them, there was a very important person that couldn't be separated from when sailing in high-risk waters, the lookout. It was the person who climbed to the highest point of the sail and identified the hidden reefs. In fact, it was not only the hidden reefs, but also the mastery of the sea map, the adjustment of the route, the prediction of the ocean weather, and the warning before the arrival of danger. Don't be fooled by the fact that this class was inconspicuous. It was an indispensable character among the small fries. There were 2 lookouts on the rock who took turns to be on duty. The one with the rough voice was the master, who had 20 years of sailing experience. He was also one of the few lookouts who had passed through the ghost sea several times. In this aspect, he was even more experienced than the captain. It was also because of his existence that this large ship could successfully navigate this route. The other one was the one he was shouting for, his disciple, the sea rabbit. When the sailors below heard his shouts, they had some free time to help him call for help. The layout of every merchant ship was that the passengers lived on the upper deck, and the crew lived in the cabins below the deck. No matter how loud one's voice was, when the crew had nothing to do, they were basically sleeping. They did not have the leisure to enjoy the beautiful scenery of the sea. When you considered traveling as a job, it was not much fun, but just a way to make money. However, the sailors searched the entire bottom of the ship, but even after searching every nook and cranny of the ship, they still couldn't find the sea rabbit. This wasn't anything new. The Great Rock could be considered a large ship in this world. There were hundreds of proper cabins and countless small spaces in the corners. There were piles of goods, daily necessities, and all kinds of miscellaneous items. If they really wanted to hide a person, even if the entire ship was mobilized, it would still take a very long time to find someone familiar with the layout of the cabins. This sea rabbit had nimble hands and feet, and his mind was very flexible. It was especially easy for him to not be found. The owner of the rough voice was clearly somewhat impatient. Fighting a lookout on a lookout was not an easy task. It required full concentration because this was not only related to the safety of everyone on the ship, but also their own lives. If the ship was destroyed and people fell into the sea, it would basically be death. Drifting and seeking survival, dream on. I don't know what I ate yesterday, but my stomach feels a little uncomfortable. I urgently need to take care of it, but this little bastard is nowhere to be found. How hateful! Without waiting for anyone to come, he grabbed the rope and swung down like a monkey. In a few moments, he had already landed on the deck. He was in his 40s or 50s, but his agility was not inferior to that of a young man. He wouldn't run to the lower deck to look for someone. After all these years, how could he not know his disciple's character? Walking towards the second level of the ship's deck, this was also where the Great Rock's most respectable cabin was located. Right now, the people living here were all the dancers from Crescent Moon, each of them extremely charming and alluring, tugging at one's heartstrings. Just as he stepped onto the second level of the deck, a person ran towards him. He was very capable and had a mouth full of white teeth. His face revealed an unconcealable craftiness. Seeing that his master had found him, he chuckled and jumped up. Using the rope at the side, he directly jumped up from the porthole to the top of the cabin. After a few more jumps, he had already climbed up to the mast. His voice came from afar. If there's something, this disciple will do the work. Why does master have to come and find me personally? The rough man had just raised his hand, but he couldn't hit the person, nor could he chase after him. His stomach was not feeling too good. This stinking brat, everything was good. Not to mention that he was clever. He could learn anything at once. But he had a bad habit. Every time there was a guest on the ship, he would definitely climb up the window, relying on his agility. Other than himself, who could see everything clearly from a high place, no one else had discovered him. With a snort, he ran towards the side of the ship where there was no one. Noah was perfect. Who didn't have this or that small habit of sailing? When he got older and married a wife, he reckoned that he wouldn't have this habit anymore. The sea hare climbed up the mast in a few moves. His body was light and agile, making him the most suitable candidate for this position. In addition, his eyesight was outstanding, and he had a natural affinity with the sea map. Therefore, in this position, he could be considered a trustworthy person. The mast was more than 10 john tall. It was the thickest mast on the Great Rock. With this height, when the sea was complicated, the waves were high, and the wind was strong. Swaying left and right was like riding a roller coaster. Huh? Roller coaster? What was that? It seemed to have suddenly popped out of his mind. Even among the sailors, not everyone had the ability to look out on the lookout. Just overcoming the fear in one's heart and maintaining balance at any time and place was not something an ordinary person could do. He also had to find the reefs in the distance, compare them with the sea map in his hand, and eat a little snack from time to time. He never vomited. It was as if he was born for the sea. Right now, the sea was still calm and tranquil, and the little watchtower he was on only swayed a few dozen feet. Tying himself to the mast and enjoying the waves, it was as normal as eating and drinking to him. The sea in the distance became deeper, turning from dark blue to black. That was the ghost sea. However, he didn't care. He had no family and no job. What was there to care about with a rotten life? Not to mention, there were so many young ladies on the ship. Even if he died and went to the underworld, he wouldn't be lonely, right? Thinking of those dancers, his immature face revealed a trace of wretchedness that didn't match his age at all. As expected of dancers. That figure, that skin, that white and shiny, that bumpy. He just didn't know what it would feel like if he pinched it. He stretched out his hand and looked at his hands that were as rough as sand because of years of work. He wouldn't scratch his delicate skin, right? He liked to peep. This problem wasn't innate. It was developed after he came to Dapeng. Because he had just boarded the ship, he couldn't do any complicated or technical work. Therefore, he boiled bathwater for the ship's boss for a year. Yes, the ship's boss was also a woman. Her name was Sea Widow. Her methods were ruthless, and she was good at managing her subordinates. She had been in this sea for many years and was a very famous person in the world of navigation. However, he actually didn't experience these things. What secrets could he, a little guy who had just boarded the ship, know? The only secret was that because he often had to boil bathwater, he enjoyed the benefits of being in a favorable position. Since he had accidentally taken a peek at her body, he couldn't let it go. Actually, if he were to compare carefully, he still felt that the ship's boss was more pleasing to the eye. It was as if every piece of flesh was full of impact, as soft as a deep-sea jellyfish. He liked everything white and soft. Chapter 2035. But today, the sea hare's mind was not on those white bodies. Even though he had already seen those white bodies over the past 3 months, even if he closed his eyes, he could still distinguish the differences between each one. Today, his mind was very strange. It was as if he had suddenly grown up and started to think about his future. Future? What would the journey be like? Where would the danger come from? What kind of place was Zhongzhou? He had been on the rock for years. Even if there were white bodies to see, what practical problems could it solve? What puzzled him even more was that when he looked into the distance from the observation deck, he really wanted to know what was at the end of the sea, what was high up in the sky, and so on. Strange thoughts like these surprised him. There was also a trace of fear in his surprise. Am I possessed by some kind of monster? It seems like my life is no longer as muddle-headed as before. The sea hare was thinking about his own thoughts. He withdrew his gaze from the sea and turned to look at the ship. They had not entered the ghost sea yet, so he did not need to concentrate. Moreover, after this peeping, he began to change. He no longer put all of his thoughts on the observation deck, which he thought was incomparably sacred. It was just to trick him into working. It was all bullshit to coax a child. With such a thought in mind, he looked at the various people on board in a different light. Before, he had only divided the people on board into two classes, those who were worth peeping at, and those who were not. But now he had a new idea. Those who were busy on deck, and those who were resting in the cabins, were given a different meaning in his mind. Looking at them, he could see some abnormalities. In this world, there were superpowers. It was not cultivation, but something that seemed to be innate. Some people had it, while others did not. If one had this kind of force, then one's chances in life would be far greater than those who did not. This was because force could directly affect one's strength, stamina, speed, and other basic physical attributes, and even the level of intelligence. Of course, how to train and improve one's force was not something that a low-level person like him could figure out. He looked down from the observation tower and found that he could actually see who had origin power and who didn't. He had never heard of such a thing in his monotonous and ordinary life. Something like origin power wouldn't protrude out on its own, just like how a person's fighting spirit would turn into a horse. A person with greater strength could be born with origin power or a naturally strong physique. There must be a way to distinguish the difference in this world, but he, the sea rabbit, had never come into contact with such a profound thing. Therefore, he found it very strange that he could see whether others had the force or not. But when he woke up, there were too many strange things, so it didn't matter. He just felt like he had changed into a different person. From what he could sense, there were almost 100 people on the Great Rock, but only a dozen or so had origin power. This ratio was considered normal in this world, but what wasn't normal was the composition. It wasn't strange for the captain, the Sea Widow, to be an origin power user. Someone who could lead a ship for over a decade and make a name for himself couldn't be an ordinary person. The dance troupe from the Crescent Archipelago had a total of 9 people, and all of them were origin power users. This was a little inconceivable. What was the purpose of such a group going to the Central State? Weren't they afraid of being targeted by the Emperor? The first mate, Redbeard, was an origin power user. The bosun was also an origin power user. There were also 2 passengers whose names were unknown, but that was probably it. No, there was one more, and he was also an origin power user. A total of 15 people. That was the sum of all the origin power users on the Great Rock. It couldn't be said that they were the rulers who decided the fate of this voyage, but at least they were the main controllers, including the Sea Rabbit. What did the appearance of these origin power users represent? He was now confused. If it were in the muddle-headed and mediocre days before, he wouldn't even think about these things. As long as he could eat his fill and see his white hair every day, nothing else mattered. But now it was different. He seemed to have suddenly become a person who knew how to think. Who am I? What am I doing here? When he had this kind of thought, he had already realized that this was probably his last time going out to sea. Although this kind of experience was very meaningful, a person's life couldn't be repeated like this again and again. What was worse than repetition was that this kind of repetition was full of danger. Being a lookout was really too boring. When the sea was calm, the job of a lookout was the most boring job in the world. One couldn't always keep one's eyes on the sea level. If one looked for too long, it would be easy to form hallucinations. Therefore, the job of the lookout had to learn to relax from time to time, especially the eyes. The Sea Rabbit took out a short spear from the back of his waist. It was a triangular shape, about a foot long, and was the standard weapon of the crew. When traveling on the sea, very few people were equipped with spears and broadswords. Most of them were long-range crossbows and short-range stabs. Other weapons couldn't be used at all on a ship that was swaying violently. It was too narrow, and it was shaking all the time. Because this short spear had not been used for too long, and because it had been soaked in seawater, it had long been rusted. Originally, it was just an ordinary item on the ship. Coupled with the carelessness of the owner, it was purely a decoration. In the past, he never thought that he would ever need to use such a thing. But now, he no longer thought that way. Since he had nothing better to do, he decided to do it. He quickly slid down from the watchtower and made his way into the ship's kitchen. Before the cook could react, he picked up half a potato and a whetstone and climbed back up to the watchtower while the cook scolded him. On the ship, half a piece of potato was much more expensive than meat. It was said that if one ate it often, they wouldn't have night blindness. When he returned to the lookout, his eyes swept across the sea. Under his hawk-like gaze, he didn't find anything unusual. There shouldn't be any abnormalities in this sea. He began to sharpen his short spear. He was surprised to find that his movements were skillful and experienced. It should be known that any skill needed to be learned, including sharpening a kitchen knife. If the knife was not sharpened properly, it would be ruined. But when he was sharpening this more complicated triangular spear, he didn't feel unfamiliar at all. It was as if he was born to know this kind of weapon. On the lookout, no one could see his movements. Of course, the sound blended into the background of the sea. It couldn't even be compared to the cries of the seabirds circling the ship. Sharpening like this, looking at the sea surface, sharpening again, thinking about the things on his mind. Before the sky turned dark, he finally finished sharpening the short spear. Because of the material, it didn't look very shiny. But he knew that this kind of sharpness was enough for him to stab anywhere he wanted. His fingers rotated, and the short spear obediently turned into a thorny flower in his hand. A very familiar feeling welled up in his heart. What's wrong with me? Could it be that I've awakened some kind of skill? I've never heard that the force could be used like this. Chapter 2036. The sea hare came down to get some food during dinner. He was on duty now, so of course, he couldn't eat with the crew. In fact, most of the crew members ate alone and were in a hurry. After all, there were many positions that couldn't be left without people. Don't be lazy at night. You have to observe at all times in case of ghost reefs. If there is an accident, you don't have to worry about your money and food being deducted. You can directly throw into the sea to feed the fishes and turtles. The first mate happened to bump into him and was very rude. He had such a position on the Da Peng's ship. He was only under one person and above everyone else. The sea hare was submissive. Just like before, he looked like a punching bag. This was his character all the time. It was just that he was really timid before, but now he was pretending to be timid. Before he was completely sure whether his change was good or bad, and whether his ability was weak or strong, he wouldn't show any abnormalities. This kind of forbearance was not the same as before, but now he was very familiar with it and could handle it with ease. He was cowering here, but his master, Uncle Shrimp, stood quietly behind him. He held his shoulder with one hand like an iron clamp, not letting him turn around and leave. Although he didn't say anything, the meaning was very clear. The first mate glanced at the master and disciple, and finally didn't say anything excessive. It was okay to throw one person into the sea to feed the fishes, but they couldn't throw all of them into the sea. The ghost sea was dangerous, and it couldn't be separated from the master and disciple service. So he snorted and left unhappily. Uncle Shrimp waited until he went far away, and then he slapped the sea hare's neck. The rough slap made the sea hare feel pain. Seeing that the sea hare was still glaring at him, he couldn't help but scold. "You only know how to be arrogant in front of me. You really have the ability. Why were you scared just now? You're a bastard. You're not good enough. Go back and look. If something really goes wrong, I will throw you into the sea to feed the fishes and turtles." The sea hare's face was full of grievances. He walked up awkwardly. Of course, he knew who was close and who was distant. His master was just scaring him. He blamed him for weakening the prestige of the Da Peng crew in front of outsiders. This first mate was not a member of the Da Peng crew. How did this person come here? Only the boatman, Widow C, knew that. According to Uncle Shrimp, this man was the first mate of this trip. When they arrived at the destination, he would naturally leave. With Widow C's ability, she didn't need a helper at all. Therefore, the first mate had actually come specifically for this long voyage. It was just that it was unclear whether he was from the Crescent Islands or not. Or were they from a central state? Or was he a donor who was trying to make a profit by pulling strings for this transaction? He was not on the same side as the crew of the Great Rock, and he was harsh and merciless, so he was not very popular, but he did not know that. How could such a person, who didn't know the ways of the world at all, dare to stay with everyone on the Great Rock for the past few years? Wasn't he afraid that everyone would throw him into the sea to feed the fishes and shrimps? The sea hare could not understand it before today, but now she understood. This first mate was probably not an ordinary person. He was very scheming. He knew very well that even if he offended all the crew members, as long as he didn't offend the old widow, he wouldn't be in danger. On the other hand, if you knew how to be a person and let everyone treat you as a brother, then you could control the ship and win the hearts of the people. What would the old widow think? He found that he had changed a lot. The direction of the people's hearts was so complicated that he could not understand it before. Now, he could understand it clearly without using his brain. Everyone was living in their own way. Then, what should he, the sea hare, live in? To be free and not be bullied, to have a leisurely job, and to have a lot of time to look at the white flowers? Although he was scolded, he still carefully searched the sea several times until he confirmed that there was no danger. The mood after being scolded and beaten was one thing, but the work that should be done must be done well. This was a responsibility. Otherwise, everyone would be fed to the fishes and shrimps, including him, the sea hare. Actually, from the perspective of a reminder, the first mate's words were not wrong. This place was already very close to the Ghost Sea. When a master came to take over the shift tomorrow morning, they would officially enter this vast, legendary land of death. The Ghost Reef was one of the most famous among the countless dangers in the Ghost Sea. It was not a submerged reef. The reason why it was called a ghost reef was because no one knew when it would appear and where it would be. Once the observation was not careful, it would be a disaster for the ship. The Ghost Reef was actually not a reef, but a huge, deep-sea creature, similar to the existence of a fish. It was a relatively special sea turtle. Its body size was very large. The largest was as big as a small island, and the smallest was as big as a reef. This thing liked to come out at night when the moon was bright, or it could be understood as swallowing and spitting moonlight. However, this characteristic was undoubtedly a disaster for passing ships. If there happened to be a hui floating on the surface of the sea, with its characteristic of half-floating, half-sinking, motionless body and incomparably sharp back shell, the entire bottom cabin would be cut open when a ship crashed into it, and there would be no way to save it. This thing did not eat people. It only ate aquatic plants and other vegetables. However, this characteristic made every old seafarer in the Ghost Sea pale with fright. Therefore, it was called the Ghost Reef. Therefore, there must be a lookout at all times, because you did not know when such a thing would suddenly appear in front of you. It was impossible to mark it on the sea map. Although they had not really entered the Ghost Sea, who could be sure that they would not occasionally come out to wander around the edge, especially tonight when the moon was full and bright? Touching the short thorn behind his waist, the sea hare laughed. He would not overreact to such words, but if it was a bit excessive, he would not mind stabbing it. He did not know why, but he was very confident in his own actions. It was as if there was nothing in the world that he could not stab, whether it was a person or an object. As the night came, the lights on the ship lit up one by one. From the highest cabin on the second floor, there was a faint singing sound. There were also shadows of dancing figures. He knew that these were the dancers practicing their dance. Diligence was the key to success. Even the dancers were the same. In recent years, if they did not practice from time to time, they would not be able to pick up their waist when they arrived. If their waist was stiff, how could they dance? They could not let the Emperor of Central Prefecture be unhappy and kill them all. Restraining the desire in his heart, he felt a bit strange. Since these dancers were people with origin power, then how could he have safely peeped on them for 3 months without anyone knowing? There was also the Sea Widow. He had peeped on her for a few years. He did not believe that an old origin power user would not know about this. 1 or 2 women had the hobby of being peeped on, but not all of them, right? Then what was the problem? What was the reason for them to tolerate the blasphemy of a small person like him? Of course, there was another possibility, which was also the most fantastical possibility. This was the first time that he, the sea hare, knew that he had origin power. It was inexplicable. Then, could it be that everyone was like him? After sailing for 3 months, something miraculous happened. As a result, some people on this ship awakened their origin power. Chapter 2037. The sea hare was very annoyed because he felt that his current life was not as carefree and happy as it was when he was in a muddle-headed state. Now that he was smart, there were more things to do. Sighing, his gaze swept across the ship and finally landed on the lifelike beast carved on the bow of the ship. It was a very beautiful fox head, a very strange beast head. In this world of great navigation, shouldn't it be more appropriate to carve the appearance of a sea beast? Fox. Is it powerful in the sea? He was tied up on the lookout for the whole night, but he couldn't think of anything. When his mind became complicated, his innocence left him forever, and those happy and simple days were gone. In the early morning before the sun rose, it was also the darkest time on the sea. Even though he had been accustomed to this kind of black and white work and rest schedule, he still couldn't help but feel sleepy, and all his senses became dull. At this moment, a sound came. According to his experience, it should be the sound of something falling into the water. When a ship was sailing, such a movement was normal. All kinds of garbage and discarded items would be thrown into the sea, who would take them to the relay supply point to unload. But right after that, a sharp and high-pitched female voice spread across the entire deck. "Oh no, oh no! Xiao Yuan fell into the water." Immediately, there were people surging on the deck, coming from all directions. He didn't move because this was his duty. The more chaotic the situation was, the more he couldn't mess up because his master, Uncle Shrimp, often told him that misfortunes never came alone. What he could do was to ensure that there were no submerged reefs in front of the ship. When he was free, he could also look back to see if there was anyone floating on the sea. It was a mess below. Because of the distance, he couldn't hear clearly. He could only focus on the sea behind the ship, but unfortunately, he didn't see anything. Even with his eyesight, in such a dim, early morning, it was impossible to see a human figure clearly on the sea. This was beyond the scope of what humans could do. The cruel fact was that even if he found someone, he might not be able to save her. This was the sea, the deep sea, and there were waves in the sea without wind. In the cold winter, even if people could swim in the water, their hands and feet would be frozen after a while, and they would lose their mobility, consciousness, and finally their lives. A person's shout was meaningless in the sea. Besides, he might not be able to shout out. He didn't find anyone at all. He didn't even turn around to look for her. This wasn't land. Stop the sails, go against the wind, and pull the oars. With a series of actions, it wouldn't take long for you to return to the spot where you fell into the water. Most importantly, the person who fell into the water had already been swept away. Where could they find him? And this was under the premise that they could see the person who had fallen into the water. As the captain of the ship, Sea Widow's orders were cold and merciless. The great rock continued to move forward without any orders to change sails. This was the ocean, and everything had to conform to the rules of navigation. It seemed ruthless, but in fact, it was the accumulated experience of humans over a long period of time. It was still a mess below, but the sea hare was sitting on top. It was a very good position to observe the whole ship. When someone shouted that they had fallen into the water, he instinctively did not look for the person who had fallen into the water. Instead, he searched on the deck. This was not his habit. At least, it was not his habit in the past. But now, he was very familiar with it. He put the victim aside and looked for the murderer. If the victim didn't fall into the water by accident, there must be traces of the murderer leaving in a hurry. He didn't know what to say about such indifference towards life. He was a little disgusted with the current situation. Uncle Shrimp climbed up. This was the time they had agreed to change shifts. A dancer named Xiao Yuan fell into the water. It is said that she went to the toilet. Was it man-made? Or did she slip? No one knows. You should be very familiar with this woman, right? You have been watching her for 3 months? Facing the sea hare's gaze, Uncle Shrimp was expressionless. The sea hare secretly felt that it was a pity. Of course, he was familiar with this body. Although he had not said a word, he was familiar with this body. There was a black mole on the inner thigh. From the perspective of physiognomy, it didn't seem very auspicious. Of course, no one would look at this place by physiognomy, except for one kind of physiognomy. The bad thing was not the mole, but the tuft of hair on the mole. This woman had the force in her body, so there was no possibility of her slipping. Dancers were also physical workers. Their bodies were flexible and flexible. They could even dance on palm-sized parts. How could she fall? The sea hare was not interested in finding out the reason. In his opinion, if this woman was harmed by someone, it was most likely due to the internal conflict of the dancers. Because the dancers had no disputes with other people since they boarded the ship, who would do something to them, except for the internal strife for the right to dance in the central state. He went back to his cabin to sleep. This was the main cabin of the bottom crew. There were 7 or 8 people living in one cabin. The smell was strange. He had long been used to it, so he didn't care. In the cabin, except for those who were on night duty like him who were sleeping, the others had already gotten up to do something. It didn't seem crowded. He was woken up by someone, which made him blame himself. It was a normal situation, but now it made him feel uneasy. He should be more vigilant. He didn't know why, but he felt danger here. There was no reason, it was just intuition. Boss High asked me to tell you that we are about to enter the Ghost Sea. He asked you to wipe the fox head clean. A sailor shouted in his ear, gloating. The fox head was the beast head on the bow of the Dapeng. It didn't look conspicuous with the ship from a distance, but it was actually a huge iron sculpture with a height of 3 people. It had both the beauty and the function of a ram. Because it was made of cast iron, it was easy to rust when riding the wind and waves on the sea. Generally, the rules of the sea attached great importance to the beast head. It was regarded as a totem and a psychological sustenance to protect the safety of the ship. Every time it docked at the shore, it would be polished again. However, the Dapeng had been out for too long, and there was no plan to dock at the supply point yet. Before entering the Ghost Sea, they needed to pay respects to the sea god and pray for their safety. One of the most important things to do was to make the beast head clean and shiny. This was the rule of the sea, and there was no one in this line who didn't believe in this. The beast's head was hanging in front of the ship's bow. If one wanted to really clean it, they could only throw people off the ship's bow. This required nimbleness, courage, and meticulousness. Under the flying ship's bow, there were not many people who could still act as if nothing had happened. The sea hare was one of them. He was somewhat dissatisfied. This work was very tiring. It was also very dangerous. He often did this before he was enlightened, so it didn't matter. But now that he thought about it, he was being used as a donkey. The result of being enlightened was that he was no longer willing to be enslaved. It was a good thing for him, but it might not be the same for others. Chapter 2038. He had to fill his stomach first. In the past, he would go to the kitchen and eat a few mouthfuls, but it was different now. He felt that he had been mistreated, so he wanted to make up for it. Therefore, he sat down in the dining room and enjoyed, well, actually, it was other people's leftovers. What was important was not the food, but the mood of eating. On the Great Rock, he was also a very important member. How could he be ordered around like a dog? It was not mealtime, so there were very few diners. The sailors with status and guests would not eat here. They had their own space, where the food was sent to their cabins. The sea hare ate a large pile of food on his plate, which was made of unknown materials, while enduring the nagging of the cook. However, the nagging went in one ear and out the other. The cook was not bad. Although he liked to scold people, he would always leave a portion for him. He was one of the few people on the Great Rock who was really good to him. A rarely seen person appeared in the kitchen. It was a middle-aged woman with a graceful figure. Her face was tightly wrapped in a veil, leaving only a pair of long and narrow phoenix eyes. She was full of power. She came because of the incident that happened in the early morning. She was looking for possible clues, and, at the same time, warning her subordinates to be more vigilant. Obviously, this woman also realized that something was wrong. After warning the cook, she turned her head and saw the sea hare chewing on the table. "Hare, why are you dawdling here instead of cleaning up the beast heads?" The sea hare sighed softly. He wanted to pass this voyage in a low-key way and then carefully think about his future. Just like before, he would resign himself to adversity, never retaliate when scolded, and never fight back when hit. However, he now realized that he cannot do that. It was as if all his patience had been exhausted in the past 20 years. Now, he could not even endure one more time. Why did he have such a mentality? Was it because he could not restrain the savagery in his heart like a nouveau riche? In a short day, too many things had happened. In fact, the people and things around him were not that important. What was important was the change in himself. He would not talk back to the first mate because he felt that it was easier to use a short thorn. However, he was indebted to Boss High after all. You should at least let me have a full meal first. Even if you want to order a donkey, you should first tie a carrot to it, right? See Widow's eyes narrowed. Why did a bunch of inexplicable things happen when they were just about to enter the ghost sea? First, it was a dancer who fell into the water, and then this little fellow who had listened to her for 10 years started to talk to her with a completely unfamiliar attitude. See Rabbit, do you want to get better? Have you learned how to talk back to me? Who gave you the guts? The sea hare swallowed a mouthful of food and said slowly, "No one gave me the courage, because the courage grew on my body. People have to grow up. You can't always treat me like an insensible child." Sea Widow took a deep breath. She felt that there was something wrong with this voyage. Everyone had become strange, as if something bad had affected everyone on the ship. However, this little fellow shouldn't have. See Rabbit, don't forget who was the one who pulled you onto the boat, fed you, and taught you skills when you were all alone and helpless. Now, do you think your wings have hardened? Sea Rabbit was very calm, but it was this calmness that made Sea Widow feel a chill in her heart. So I have to serve you for the rest of my life? Be at his beck and call for a lifetime? Never ask for a reward for a lifetime? Be a cow for a lifetime? Give me a piece of meat when you're happy? Kick me when you're unhappy? Are you treating me like a dog? It's true that you pulled me in, but if you didn't pull me in at that time, I might not have died. Maybe it's another life. Don't think of yourself as a savior. In this world, there is no kindness that is worth a person using their entire life to repay. I have repaid you for 10 years, regardless of gains and losses. Isn't it about time? Don't you feel that you need to use a more equal way to get along? A suitable reward, a suitable treatment, a suitable position. See Widow's anger rushed straight up. This was the child that she had raised. Now, it seemed that she had raised an ingrate. She had the intention to deal with him now, but she knew that the time and place were not right. The current Dapeng was not peaceful, and she was the boss. She could not aggravate the conflict among the crew. She clenched her teeth. Come to my cabin at night. I have something to tell you. The sea hare finally finished his food and wobbled out. Do you want something substantial? Don't always use words to paint a pie in the sky. Sea Rabbit felt a lot better after walking out under Sea Widow's murderous gaze. As a human, he still had to have a clear mind. If he kept holding it in, he would fall sick. He took out tools from the tool cabin and coiled a long rope. This was not the first time he had done this, so he was not unfamiliar with it. There were sailors on the bow deck and guests looking at the sea. They were afraid and curious about the legend of the ghost sea. They only wanted to see something, but other than the vast sea, they could not see anything. How to fix the rope so that there would not be any accidents under any circumstances was the basic skill of the crew. No sailor did not know how to play with ropes. Sea Rabbit was naturally proficient in this, so he personally did it. This kind of thing cannot be left to others. After the preparations were done, he said a few words to a sailor, probably to prevent guests from getting close to him. He was only a low-level existence, so he could not command others. He could only ask others to do it. Whether others cared about it or not, it all depended on their friendship and mood. There should be warning signs, pulling lines, and someone to look after it. Sea Rabbit thought of the safety measures that should be in place. He did not know where he had learned these skills. However, on the ships of this world, it was all about experience, and there were no special rules and regulations. With a rope tied around his waist, he dropped down from the bow and quickly disappeared from everyone's eyes. This was just one of the daily jobs of the sailors, so no one cared. When he reached the position of the fox's head, he did not stop. Instead, he continued to descend, avoiding the iron fox's head, and found the wooden ship wall. Here, he added a second layer of insurance for himself. 2 long iron nails, and a thin rope. This was the backup safety lock just in case. Because everything was under the bow, no one would notice. Moreover, the iron nails and the thin rope were all in his line of sight, so no one could play tricks. This was not a normal safety measure. It was something that his mind had naturally thought of. Although even he found it strange that he had such thoughts, there was one thing that was absolutely safe. What happened to me? It was as if there was an extra thought in my mind. Or was it the kind of thought that had gone through the vicissitudes of life and was extremely rich in life experience? C. Rabbit could not understand, so he stopped thinking about it and focused on his work. The future was the future, and now was the present. He still had to do what he had to do. This ship, even he himself felt that it was full of strangeness. Chapter 2039. Working under the bow of the ship was a different experience. Only someone like him, who had been working in Wangdo all year round, could adapt to the job of going up and down and working in a leisurely manner. But the sea hare was still very serious. This was a kind of character. Walking was walking, doing was doing. The fox's head was very big. After months of sailing, it was soaked in seawater and rusted. To the sea hare, the fox's nose was easy to polish, and it was easy to ride on it. But the trouble was that the chin was suspended in the air. The sharp fox's mouth protruded several feet. This could be a sharp weapon for impact, but polishing it was very difficult. The body was suspended in the air and could not exert strength. The sea hare instinctively did not rush the work. Generally, in this kind of situation, the sailors would not hesitate to finish the work as soon as possible. No one liked to be hung up for a day like this. Polishing the iron beast head was a very hard and physically exhausting job. Even a strong man in a normal position would be tired and sweaty, not to mention being hung in the air without a place to lean on. His physical strength was very good, and he also had the force. After working for a long time, his body was strong, but he was not a Superman. Instinctively, he did not choose to rush the work. Instead, he chose to grind and rest. This may delay more time, but the benefits were obvious. He could maintain a relatively abundant physical strength at all times to deal with possible changes. In the past, he did not have this awareness, but now it was different. His behavior was consciously or unconsciously following the guidance in the depths of his mind. He was no longer the ignorant youth. From morning to afternoon, the sun was about to set. The whole fox's head was polished and shiny. There was still a small part of it to be finished. It was estimated that he could still make it in time for dinner. At this moment, the rough stone in his left hand was sliding on the mottled rusty surface under the fox's mouth. He felt his body become light and suddenly fell. He was less than 10 feet away from the surface of the sea. The sea water had already wet his trousers. He felt his waist tighten, so tight that he took a deep breath. He regretted that he was still inexperienced. The second safety rope was too thin. The waist should have been replaced with a belt. Although he was in a dangerous situation, he did not panic at all. It was as if he had experienced similar dangers countless times. As the rope swayed, his right hand pulled out a short thorn. When he was close to the ship's wall, he fiercely stabbed and fixed himself to the ship's wall. The shipbuilding technology in this world was not very brilliant. The ship's planks were very rough. It looked smooth from afar, but it was not. As a veteran sailor of 10 years, he was no stranger to climbing up the ship's walls to the deck. With the help of a short thorn, the rivets hanging from the wall of the boat, and the rope net hanging from a boat, he began to slowly climb up. Instead of going to the front of the ship, they went along the side of the ship, where the angle of the ship's wall was not so steep. They also didn't shout for help, but remained silent. A long, heavy piece of the broken rope still hung from his body. He did not untie it and throw it away, because he would have to judge the position of the assailant by the length and the length of the break. This weight wasn't much to someone like him who possessed origin power. His stamina wasn't a problem because he didn't need to rest often. He was not a person who would make a ruckus after being beaten. He came quietly and returned quietly. First, they had to climb up to the deck safely. In this season, if they fell into the sea, they wouldn't be able to play anymore. As he approached the deck, He stopped his movements and quietly listened to the sounds on the deck. Only after he confirmed that there was no danger lying in ambush did he gracefully flip onto the deck. Holding the short dagger in his sleeve, he leaped onto the deck and quickly rolled a few times. His series of movements flowed like water, but unfortunately, no one cheered. Patting his butt, he stood up as if nothing had happened and looked up. There were a few guests strolling at the front of the ship, lingering on the beautiful scenery of the sunset over the sea. He didn't see any of the sailors. This was normal. It was mealtime, so there was a difference between early and late. From his position, there were a few places on the ship that could be observed, such as the main rudder cabin, a few cabins with good observation conditions, and the lookout. There was no place to look, and there was no way to find out who was secretly observing his movements. This damned voyage. He didn't make a fuss, nor was he cautious. Instead, he untied the main rope that had been cut off from his body in a doffa manner. The cut was smooth, and it was obvious that it was cut by a sharp weapon. Before he went down, he carefully checked the rope, and it was in perfect condition. Of course, it couldn't have been cut in half a day. The assailant was very straightforward, as if they didn't care to hide. After checking the length of the remaining rope, he quickly found the place where the rope was cut. There were no traces of a new cut on the deck, which meant that it wasn't cut by a knife or an axe. There wasn't enough information, and he might not be able to find any meaningful answers from the traces. He could only find out who had appeared on the deck from the people. This wasn't easy either. The crew and the guests were not familiar with each other, and there might not be anyone who would be willing to testify for him. If it was in the past, he would not let this matter go and report it to the boss to investigate the real culprit. But now he wouldn't. It seemed that it was normal for others to want to kill him, and the simplest way was to wait for him to make his move. It was a very confident and lazy way of thinking. To be honest, he felt that it was more important to understand his own problem than to understand the ship's problem. After dinner, before he took over the master's duty, he went to the boss cabin. This was also the place he often visited, but as he grew older, he came less and less. This was a trouble of growing up. In the cabin, Sea Widow finally stopped wearing the veil that seemed to never leave her body and returned to her original appearance. An enchanting beauty appeared in front of him, and for someone of his age, it was an irresistible temptation. But he was no longer the same person. Even if it was such a beauty, he would only be stunned for a moment, and then it would be over. Sea Widow was even more surprised. She was very clear about the origin of this little guy. As long as she removed the veil, there was nothing she couldn't get, especially these green melons. But reality was cruel. In front of this little guy that she thought she was very familiar with, her arrangements didn't seem to be of any use. She still didn't give up. "Rabbit, you haven't boiled water for me for a long time, right? Do you want to boil it again?" The corner of the sea rabbit's mouth twitched. "Of course. Sister Hai has been working hard for a day, and I can still help you relax. But please don't treat me like a child, okay? If Sister Hai just wants to know something, why don't you just say it?" Sea Widow's face gradually turned cold. She didn't want to pay anything, or rather, even if she wanted to pay something, there must be a price worth it, and someone who was worth it. She was a merchant on a ship, not a brothel or a brothel. "Sea Rabbit, you've grown up and your wings have hardened. Do you want to fly far away?" Sea Rabbit smiled. When a young eagle grows up, it will eventually fly away. "Sister Hai, you know that you can't keep anyone here, and I can't always stay here to help you. I have my world, my life, and my future. You can't give it to me. Why make things difficult for everyone? Let's leave some fate, and when we meet again in the future, we can still be friends. Who knows? Maybe we could support each other." Chapter 2040. Sea Widow realized that she had nothing to say because the little guy was right. She wanted to get a fool who might be loyal to her for the rest of his life through sure inlay at a cheap price. But if this fool one day understood her value, then everything she did would be meaningless. 10 years without any reward, just by eating and drinking insignificant food, she could get a lookout who was proficient in all kinds of skills. If the value could be measured, she would have taken it back with interest. The only difference was that the change in the Fool was too sudden, and it happened at this critical juncture. As the boss of the ship, she had many ways to control her subordinates. The simplest and most violent way was to beat them up until they would never forget it and would not dare to rebel. She was not a soft-hearted person. Even if they had followed her for 10 years, she could still beat them up. But the problem was that the timing of this kid's rebellion was very precise. They were sailing to the Ghost Sea and needed manpower. It was easy to injure and educate him, but then what? It was impossible for Uncle Xia to persist for several months in the Ghost Sea alone. So, she could only be gentle first, and teach this rebellious fellow a lesson when they reached the central region or out of the Ghost Sea. There were rules on the ship at sea. Boarding the ship was like joining a gang. How could it be possible for all of them to leave? Unless they were disabled and could no longer be used, just like the bandits. Knowing that she could not change this little guy who had begun to understand with words, she lost interest in continuing the conversation. All these years on the Great Rock, she was arrogant and domineering. She could not soften her stance, nor could she really give this little guy any benefits. She did not rely on women to get her current position. Okay, you can go back. We still have a few months, enough for you to think it over. Remember, if you change your mind one day, you can come to me. Seeing that we have been together for 10 years, there is still room for redemption. Looking at the sea hare walking out neatly, she suddenly thought of something. Right, you should be cleaning the beast head at the bow today, right? But why did you come up from the side when I saw you in the cockpit? The sea hare stopped and said carelessly, "The rope broke. If I was not smart, I would be sleeping in the belly of the fish now." Sea Widow raised her eyebrows. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" The sea hare shrugged. "Is it useful to tell you? Can you still conduct an investigation in the middle of the vast ocean? We can't afford to offend the guests, and it's not good for the people on our ship to be suspicious. If we make everyone panic, in the end, I have to be careful and leave it for the future." Widow High stared at him, not only because of this matter, but also because of his indifferent attitude when he spoke, as well as his analysis that hit the nail on the head. This was not something that a sensible young man should be able to say, but she couldn't blame him because what he said was the truth. "I don't know about the others, but before you came up, no one left the cockpit, including the first mate." The sea hare understood what she meant. It was not a secret that the first mate did not like him on the Great Rock. She said this so that he would not doubt the first mate. Of course, he would also not suspect that she would secretly kill him. There were many people in the cockpit, and they could all ask each other for evidence. She walked to the cabin door and turned around. "Sister Hai, this journey won't be peaceful. You have to be careful. As for me, you don't have to worry about it." Sea Widow coldly snorted and said, "If there's a next time, tell me when you see the person clearly. Although you intend to fly alone, you are still one of my people. If anyone dares to cause trouble here, I will throw them into the sea to feed the turtles." The sea hare waved her hand and walked away indifferently. What kind of joke was this? If he had known, he would have taken care of it himself. Why bother telling others? He discovered that his current state of mind was incomparably powerful, as though he was the king on the Great Rock. This damned feeling was incomparably strange. He just didn't know if his ability could support such a state of mind. This feeling intoxicated him, and he was also very worried. Was he possessed? Did he not even know his own surname? But one thing was clear. If he was still the same person, he would have died in that accident in the afternoon. He climbed onto the lookout and replaced his master. As he had expected, Uncle Shrimp knew nothing about what had happened at the bow. Due to the blind spot, no one would pay attention to the changes on the ship. He didn't say anything. Uncle Shrimp was just an ordinary person without origin power. He was also one of the people on the Great Rock who truly cared about him and treated him as one of their own. He had a premonition, so he didn't want to drag Uncle Shrimp into this. If he wasn't careful, he would have fallen into the sea to feed the fishes and shrimps, just like little Yuan. Then the only thing they had in common was that they both had origin power. Was this the inner volume of origin power? The worst thing in this world wasn't stupidity or cleverness, but when an idiot suddenly became smart. This made him feel at a loss. He had a premonition that this kind of death would continue. He might be able to stop it, but everything wouldn't surface. Or he could condone it and see what would happen. He, the sea hare, was originally a kind person. He wouldn't allow such evil to happen. But now there was a voice in his head. In another circle, this kind of thing was normal. There was nothing strange about it. The world of origin power? All he needed to do was to watch silently. The great rock quietly sailed into the ghost sea. Ordinary people were still ordinary because they didn't understand what was happening on the ship. But there was a circle that understood very well. So, behind the politeness on the surface, there was a deep vigilance between each other. The sea hare was still 2 points in one line, watching and sleeping. He was waiting for what would happen next time. Whose turn would it be? But things seemed to have passed just like that. Nothing happened for more than 10 days. The sea was rough, but it was nothing to the experienced sailors. They didn't even encounter a ghost reef. In theory, it was a small probability for a ship sailing in the vast sea to bump into a turtle. Not every ship that passed through the ghost sea would encounter this kind of unlucky thing. But the sea hare knew that they would encounter it this time. He was waiting for the arrival of this day, not for the fate of these people, but for his own fate and the sudden changes that happened to him. He suddenly realized that he might never be able to reach the central continent. To him, it was just an illusion. He was a little impatient. With such a slow killing speed, should he give them a hand? He had never fought before, but he knew that if he really fought now, he didn't need to fear anyone. Looking at the dark night sky, a trace of emptiness rose. It was as if he wasn't real. Everything was a surprise. Chapter 2041. 10 days later, the heartless sea hare began his hunting trip again because of his relaxed state of mind. There was a disadvantage of being on the sea. There was a lack of fresh water, so bathing was a very luxurious thing. Bathing once every 10 days was considered frequent. Low-level sailors like Lu Xiaoyi would not use the precious fresh water on the ship until they reached the shore. Of course, this was not a conscious decision, but an iron law. On a long-distance sailing ship, bathing water was the only service that required a separate fee. For the same reason, the most prosperous business at any port was not even the restaurants, but the bathhouses. Therefore, it was not that the sea hare had turned over a new leaf, but that this was the first opportunity after he finally became smart. There were dozens of guests on the ship, but only a few could afford an expensive bath. Among them, the most willing to pay was the group of dancers. Their professional instincts could not be tainted. When bathing on land, of course, everyone stayed in a separate room with a big basin to serve them. The maids would wipe their backs, the servants would serve them soup, and the fresh flowers would be sprinkled. There was enough water to soak the whole body. However, under the conditions at sea, it was obviously impossible to do so. No matter how rich you were, it was impossible to supply enough clean water. There were strict restrictions after deducting the savings after drinking. Therefore, they could only use 2 basins of water to save money. In fact, it was not bathing in the normal sense. It was just wiping the body, scrubbing the back, and dipping the towel in water. 1 basin was rough scrubbing, 1 basin was fine scrubbing, 1 basin was black, and 1 basin was muddy. Such a scene was very satisfying. It was much better than a normal situation where one's entire body was submerged in the basin and they could not see anything. It was truly a scene of turbulent waves. The white light was dazzling, and the sounds of orioles and swaying willows could be heard. Her every movement caused one's imagination to run wild. The sea hare had a new career fantasy. In fact, a scrubbing worker was much more practical than a lookout, right? Of course, such an opportunity could not be missed. This was a large open cabin, with portholes on both sides. The ventilation was very good. The ship was alone on the sea, and it was on the 2nd floor, so it was relatively safe. However, this was not a problem for those who were lustful. The sea hare was lying on the porthole on the left side of the ship. Sometimes it was facing up, sometimes it was hanging upside down, and sometimes it was lying sideways. It was enjoying the view from various angles and different lighting. He had been immersed in this field for a long time, so he knew how to see clearly and how to prevent the people in the cabin from noticing the drooling face outside. Putting your face on the porthole definitely wouldn't work. Even though the porthole was dark on the outside, the people in the cabin could still easily see the situation outside with the help of the light from the corner of the cabin. Therefore, he covered his head with a black cloth, leaving only his eyes exposed. Most importantly, he had secretly hung an infuriating lantern on the horizontal bar of the mast on his side. There was a strong light shining from outside the porthole, and the people inside were blinded by the high beam. If one did not look carefully, one would not notice that there was a pair of big eyes outside that were brighter than the wind lanterns. This move was not a habit of his. Instead, it was something that he had naturally comprehended after the great change in his mindset. It was as if he was born with this talent. There were still 8 dancers left. Although everyone was naked and it was very awkward, they had been on the ship for a long time, so they could only get used to this kind of awkward bath scene. What else could they do if they were not used to it? The sea was humid, and they had to practice to maintain their condition. Sweat had accumulated on their bodies for more than 10 days, and they could not endure it any longer. Therefore, they did not pay much attention to the formalities. They did not cover themselves with gauze, because washing clothes on the ship was as difficult as bathing. They helped each other and rubbed each other. When they rubbed the itch, they laughed, and almost caused an accident outside the porthole. The sea hare was dazzled, but at least he knew that this was not the time to solve it. Even though he had a feast for the eyes, his hands were sore. He had to rely on his hands to support his body for a long time and constantly adjust the angle. Even though he was a force user, his arms were also tired. He had to rest. His hands were sore, and so were his eyes. This was only the first half, and he needed to conserve his energy, especially his eyes. As a lookout, he could easily find a small boat dozens of miles away in the sea. If it was placed in front of him, he would be able to see even the slightest hair. He even wanted to remind a certain dancer, "Hello, there are 2 strands of hair on your towel." The sea hare, who liked to help others, adjusted his footing to relax his arms. At this time, his eyes inadvertently glanced at the mast, and he felt that something was wrong. The reason was, why was there an extra wind lantern hanging on the horizontal bar of the mast? Ships sailing at night required navigation lights. The position of the navigation light was under the lookout that he was usually on duty. It was a very large and special navigation light, used to point out the position of other ships in the dark to prevent collisions. However, there could only be one such light on a ship. If there were more, it would confuse other ships. The darkness of the sea was deep, and this was the rule of navigation. The sea hare broke this rule and used a small lantern to provide cover for himself. However, when he was resting, he was surprised to find that there were 3 lanterns on the mast of the rock. In addition to the main lantern and the one he lit, there was another one, which was also on the auxiliary mast. It was even on the same horizontal bar as his lantern. The only difference was that one was on the left and the other on the right. His lantern was shining on the porthole of the dancer's cabin, and the other one was obviously shining on the right porthole. He immediately realized that he had met a fellow traveler. Oh no, a fellow traveler? For a moment, anger rose from his heart, and evil grew from his guts. This is a human disease. I can see it, but you can't. He didn't care about the spring scenery anymore. With such an audacious existence, how could he not teach him a lesson? If one day he was discovered, he would bring him out. With a flip of his right hand, a short thorn appeared in his hand, and he quietly moved along the cabin roof to the opposite side. However, what he didn't expect was that the other party's reaction was not inferior to his. Both of them were wearing black masks and holding short thorns, but the strange spectator was holding them while he was holding them in reverse. Neither of them tried to talk to each other, and with a pair of thorns, they immediately engaged in battle. At first, the sea hare was worried because he had never fought in his life, let alone a life and death battle. However, when he was forced to this point, he couldn't back down. In his opinion, he should be very powerful, but in the actual battle, his self-confidence was severely damaged. The opponent's short thorns were sharp, his reaction was agile, and his attacks were ruthless. Each of the short thorns was aimed at his vital points, and in just a few breaths, he almost lost his life. If it wasn't for his desperate struggle before death, he wondered how long he could last in the hands of this person. Danger suddenly came, and those distracting thoughts were completely thrown to the back of his mind. His whole body seemed to be controlled by instinct, and he instinctively counterattacked with his thorns. Only then did he manage to tie with the stranger, but it was still not enough. It turned out that his thinking was very naive. He was still the sea hare with no ability. The sea hare was somewhat regretful. He thought that he was different from others, but that was only his thought. Now that he was serious, he was exposed. Chapter 2042. This battle was abnormally intense, but it was very short because the cabins below soon noticed the movement at the top of the cabin. Before the dancers got dressed and rushed out, the two Lao Yin, who had quite a tacit understanding with each other, flew out, one on the left and one on the right, and disappeared into the darkness. No one knew where that stranger had run off to, but the sea hare had naturally climbed back to his watchtower. This was a bit absent from his post, but fortunately, it hadn't been long and there was no moon today. It was a good time to peep, but not a good time to come out and bask in the moonlight. The sea hare simply bandaged himself on the watchtower. He had been injured in several places, but fortunately, his reactions were extremely fast and he didn't lose his life. However, he also felt a bit of fear toward battle. He didn't have a systematic understanding of this world's combat standards. The reason he thought he could deal with anyone was because of that inexplicable self-confidence that had suddenly appeared in his heart. But now, this self-confidence was on the verge of collapse. If many origin power experts were at this level, he would sooner or later lose his little life if he continued to be so confident. The injuries had all occurred at the beginning. Later on, he threw caution to the wind and performed even better. But he knew that even if he threw caution to the wind the next time he met this person, the results would be better, but it would still be difficult to defeat the opponent. Who exactly was this person? In truth, it wasn't hard to guess. 9 of the 15 origin power experts were dancers, and 4 of the remaining 6 were from the Great Rock. He was familiar with the figures of the Sea Widow, the first mate, the bosun, and himself. Then there were only 2 guests left, and they were one of them. The sea hare decided to meet this person during the day. In the past, he wanted nothing more than to hide in a corner, but now he was thinking about things completely different. He preferred to take the initiative to attack. Uncle Shrimp was somewhat puzzled when he took over the shift in the morning. "Little brat, how'd you make Boss High unhappy? He even asked me about your recent situation." The sea hare slid down the rope while laughing. "What else can it be? Didn't I just see something I shouldn't?" He knew those 2 people who lived on the first floor of the cabin. According to the roster, he first found a fellow called Mubei. He knew at first glance that he had found the right person. This was a young man who didn't look much older than him. His face was ordinary, and there was a faintly discernible, cynical smile on his lips. He held a cigarette in his mouth, and his entire body was paralyzed on the bed. He was paralyzed, not lying down. However, the sea hare felt that it was like a poisonous snake coiled in the grass. It seemed harmless, but it would bite you at any time. As long as he made any strange movements, this person would not hesitate to bite him. Looking at him with interest, Mubei didn't have the slightest intention of getting up. Looking at his expression, it was as if he was saying, "You, a little brat, dare to fight with me for a woman?" The sea hare's first feeling was that this person was dangerous, but in this kind of danger, there seemed to be an inexplicable familiarity. He had an impulse that could not be restrained. He stood at the cabin door and did not enter. This was a necessary precaution. He realized that he could no longer waver between the original sea rabbit and the current sea rabbit. Since he could no longer return to the original sea rabbit, he might as well let the will go with it. "The rear deck. There's no one there for the time being. I'll wait for you there." After speaking, he didn't wait for a reply and turn around. The rear deck was a half-open place. Usually, there was time for sailors to repair their tools and catch seafood. The smell was more fragrant, and few people went there. It was a place where they could fight without being disturbed. He didn't know why he couldn't stand failure now, but since his consciousness was so stubborn, he didn't want to resist. Moreover, he was really fascinated by the feeling of wandering between life and death. He came to the rear deck alone and pulled out the short spike. He felt his blood begin to boil. He, who had never fought before, couldn't extricate himself after his first life and death battle last night. He yearned for it even more than peeking at the dancers bathing. He didn't know if other Origin Power users were at this level, but since this Mubei was only slightly stronger than him, then he could at least accumulate enough experience on him. If he met other experts in the future, he wouldn't be as flustered as last night. That Mubei was indeed fierce. He didn't have to wait for long before he saw this person dragging his feet. There was no one behind him. This was a conflict between the two of them, a matter between men. It was just that the reason was somewhat difficult to say. Could it be that it was to determine who had the qualifications to peak? Mubei was very straightforward and didn't feel ashamed at all. Whoever wins gets to look. Whoever loses, scram. Take a bath every 10 days. Get married one time. The sea hare was also very straightforward. Okay, get married one time. If you don't agree, then we can fight again. In an instant, the two of them were fighting. The sea hare, who had completely let go of himself this time, allowed the arrogant man to control him. Thus, he was able to display all his fighting strength that he was so proud of. This place was different from the second floor. They didn't need to constantly consider whether they should step lightly to avoid attracting other people's attention. Relatively speaking, there weren't so many bumps in the environment and space, which was more conducive to the two people's movements. Mubei's short spike was fast and fierce, while the sea hare's was even more vicious and tricky. Once the two sides started fighting, they couldn't be separated again. This time, the sea hare didn't fall behind, but he couldn't really defeat his opponent unless he was injured in exchange for his life. But the question was it worth it just to peek? After a moment, the battle became more and more intense. It had already begun to slide to the edge of danger, but neither side cared. The sea hare had the confidence to turn the tables in a desperate situation, and the opponent also had the confidence to reverse the situation before death. Seeing that it was difficult to control the situation, the sound of footsteps from the deck helped them. They still tacitly separated and then flew away. A battle without a result. But for the sea hare, it was meaningful because he was familiar with how to fight. This was the 15th day in the Ghost Sea. There were no accidents, but no one dared to take it lightly. Every day in the Ghost Sea, the sea breeze wasn't small. This was the result of the ocean currents. But today it was a rare calm. For the two people fighting, this was a good phenomenon because they could stand more steadily. But for all the experienced sailors, it wasn't a good thing. On the lookout, Uncle Xia was a little anxious. He pointed to the clouds in the distance. I estimate that the storm will come soon. I don't know how big it is. When the time comes, just stay in the cabin and don't come out. Wait for the storm to pass. For the sailors, the storm was always their biggest threat. At this time, everyone would be very busy. On the contrary, the lookout didn't need to be on the lookout. There would be thick clouds in the storm, and there would be no moonlight. The big fish wouldn't come out. The key point was if the wind and waves were too big, it would be very dangerous for people to be on the lookout. The violent swaying wouldn't be able to observe at all, so they were actually free. Of course, if necessary, they would still go out to help. But this kind of situation was rare. It depended on the specific situation of the storm. Chapter 2043. The storm came much faster than they had imagined. Under the command of Boss C, the main horizontal sail was lowered, leaving only the vertical sail to adjust the direction. When the ship encountered a storm, it was impossible to maintain the original course under the condition that the power of the wind was completely dependent on it. At this time, the most important thing to consider was whether or not the ship would sink. The correct way was to steer the ship towards the left half of the storm and go with the flow, waiting for the storm to pass before returning to the original course. Rock was a long-distance ship that specialized in crossing the ocean. The ship's structure was sturdy and the sailors were experienced. They were no stranger to this kind of storm. Each of them had their own position and responsibility. They were busy but not in chaos, anxious but not in panic. Under the correct response, the famous Sea Widow's ship had already passed through the eye of the storm after a day and a night. The wind was weak and the waves were low. However, it was not the right time to restart the route. They should check the ship's damage and mark the route again, waiting for the storm to pass completely. The reason why the Ghost Sea was called the Ghost Sea was not only because of the little risk. Generally, after a storm, there was a high possibility that a group of sea ghosts would appear behind the storm and gnaw on the ship that was destroyed in the storm. Sea monsters were notorious in the Ghost Sea. Uncle Shrimp returned to the lookout and closely monitored the sea surface. The remaining sailors were scattered around the ship, holding harpoons and short spears, waiting for the storm. The group of sea ghosts would not appear after every storm. It depended on luck. However, for Rock, their previous voyage was already very lucky. Therefore, they were facing the danger of changing their luck at any time. Sea Hare was also arranged to be at the back of the ship, guarding against any possible abnormalities with a few sailors. He was no stranger to sea ghosts. During his 10 years of sailing, he had encountered them once or twice. However, he was still young at that time and could not fight on the front line. Now that he had grown up, he naturally could not avoid his responsibility. Suddenly, a series of buzzing sounds came from the lookout. Obviously, Uncle Shrimp had discovered something. With such a warning, other than those who couldn't leave their posts, the rest of the sailors rushed to the deck, including the first mate and the bosun. Sea Hare leaned against the side of the ship. His feet were unsteady. His body swayed naturally along with the ship. It looked like his center of gravity was unstable, but in fact, he was as steady as Mount Tai. This was the most basic ability of a sailor. The sea ghosts came from the front of the ship, where the battle started first and where the pressure was the greatest. Then, the sea ghosts spread out and surrounded Da Peng to attack. To them, this was their food. The Sea Hare was guarding a corner at the stern of the ship. It wasn't nervous at all as it scanned its surroundings. A sea ghost appeared below the ship. It was half the height of a human and had a single head and body. Its 6 tentacles were covered with suction cups. It looked like an octopus, but it wasn't an octopus. It was more aggressive and had simple intelligence. The sea ghost had already swallowed a lot of seawater. It suddenly spurted out, and its body shot over the side of the ship like an arrow. Just as it was about to fall down, a short thorn pierced through its skull. It wasn't difficult for those who knew how to kill this thing, but those that didn't know how to do so were those who didn't know how to do it. There were 2 things to pay attention to. First, the attack had to be accurate. The weak spot was between the eyes. If one couldn't kill it in one hit, it wouldn't die. Second, when the 6 tentacles of this thing came together, humans would be helpless and unable to block it. Sea ghosts were especially ferocious after being injured. So, the principle was to kill in one hit and not get tangled up. The Sea Hare was like a natural killer. After fighting with Mubei twice, he had completely adapted to the fusion of his body and consciousness in battle. So this kind of thing was really just a small matter to him. To others, the ferocious sea ghosts were just a casual attack between advancing and retreating. With him around, there was no more sea ghost that could get on the ship and stir up trouble at the stern of the ship. Some of the older sailors no longer looked at him with the same contempt as before. The Sea Widow patrolled the ship. The sea ghost tide this time was only of a medium scale and was still within the range of Da Peng's ability. The bow of the ship was under the greatest pressure with the chief officer and bosun overseeing it, so she didn't need to take action. The stern of the ship, which was prone to leaks, was also very quiet. This was unexpected. A single-headed sea ghost like this could be dealt with by a strong and experienced sailor. There were no weaklings on the ship, but there were no origin power users overseeing it. It would be difficult for the dozen or so sailors at the stern of the ship to not let a few of them get on the ship. But this time, the defense seemed to be very successful. She rushed to the stern of the ship and saw the Sea Hare leisurely strolling through the messy sails, oars, and rigging. There were quite a few sea ghosts jumping up from the stern of the ship, but the dozen or so sailors were concentrated on one side of the ship. They relied on the density of their numbers to firmly control the jumping of the sea ghosts. The other side of the ship and the entire stern of the ship was empty except for the sea hare. Sea ghosts jumped up one after another, and there were even a few that jumped at the same time. But these things were nothing more than trash, throwing away their lives in front of the sea hare's incomparably sharp short spikes. One slide, one step, one stretch, one retract. The seemingly casual movement of the spikes was like the scythe of death. She had seen a lot of things. She had roamed the seas for dozens of years, and she was also an expert among origin power users. But she was afraid that even she could not do such a relaxed fighting style. She had never seen such a thing from any of the strong people she had met before. She suddenly realized that the sea hare she had always treated as a child had already grown up. The reason why he wanted to leave was because he had already awakened origin power, and it was a rather high-level origin power. With this ability, he should be the boss of the ship and a tyrant on the land. How could he stay in the low shrubs when his wings had hardened? He would definitely spread his wings and soar high. What could she use to make him stay? She realized that she did not have enough chips. Her stage was not big enough, and this little guy's awakening was unusually outstanding. She did not show herself because she had not thought of how to face this person. Should she think of a way to make him stay? Or should she let him soar so that they could meet again? If she wanted to make him stay, what could she rely on? What could she cater to his liking? Satisfy his hobby of peeping? Let him have the opportunity to peep every day? But the joy of peeping was in the word peeping. It was like the difference between a house flower and a wildflower. Once he got tired of looking, what could she use to satisfy his perverted demands? Widow Hai had a lot of experience in life. She knew that blindly satisfying a man would not be able to make him stay. But if she did not satisfy him, and he already had thoughts of leaving, it was really difficult to control him. She returned to the cockpit. She had been hesitating about this problem for a long time, so much so that she had neglected to monitor the sea surface. Only when an even more intense warning signal came from the direction of the lookout did she wake up from her momentary trance. There was no need to ask. Just by looking at the flashing golden dots on the sea surface, she knew that Da Peng was in big trouble. Chapter 2044. The sea ghost tide was both dangerous and not dangerous to the seafarers. There were different levels. If it was only at this level, almost every ship would be able to deal with it. Going up one level would only mean that there would be more sea ghosts. They would still be able to deal with it, but there would be a certain amount of casualties. The problem was the sea ghost mutation. The exact process was unknown, but there was a chance that the sea ghost would mutate for some reason during its growth. A golden color would appear on the top of its torso, as though it was wearing a golden helmet. Hence, it was called a golden helmeted ghost. This kind of golden helmeted ghost was completely different from ordinary sea ghosts in terms of individual abilities. Not only was its body more durable, it was also more cunning and incomparably strong. Ordinary people would either die or be injured after being struck by its 6 tentacles. It was no longer a species that ordinary people could resist. Only origin power users could harm it. It was not every sea ghost tide that one would encounter a golden helmet. It was a small probability event, and every time it happened, the ship would be destroyed and the passengers would perish. Unless the ship was full of origin power users. How could it be possible? This was not the most terrifying thing. The most frightening thing was that every appearance of a golden helmet meant that there would be a sea ghost king roaming the nearby seas. That was a monster that humans could not shake. Since the beginning of history, it seemed that no one had been able to get past the Sea Ghost King. Fortunately, the Sea Ghost King did not appear often and would only appear occasionally. Who would have thought that the Great Rock would hit the jackpot this time? Go and tell the guests that everyone has to participate in the battle. No one can survive alone. Some sailors dashed away. This was the rule of this world's navigation. Living in the sea meant sharing weal and woe. This was especially true when dealing with sea creatures. They would not let you off just because you were a guest and not a crew member. To them, you were all food regardless of whether you resisted or not. This was completely different from dealing with human pirates. Hence, there was no need to persuade them one by one. Everyone in this world understood this point. As long as one was an adult, one should pick up a weapon regardless of gender and face a common calamity. Very soon, everyone had gathered. What surprised her was that the number of origin power users on this ship far exceeded her expectations. She originally thought that it would be difficult to have 2 or 3, but who would have thought that there would be 10 people gathered in one go? The 2 male passengers could be considered normal, but the abnormal thing was that the 8 dancers were all origin power users. Was such a dance troupe really going to Central Continent to perform for the Emperor? For the time being, he couldn't think too much about it. He could only think about it after getting through this calamity. The Sea Hare was adjusted to the bow. It was impossible for Sea Widow to allow someone with his strength to laze around at the back of the ship. This was not a joke. It was related to the lives of everyone on the ship, including the wooden shell. It was the first time the Sea Hare had seen such a thing. It had a golden color on its head, as if it was wearing a golden melon skin hat. It blended in with the other ordinary sea ghosts and scrambled to jump onto the ship. Because of the distance, it was not his turn to make a move, nor was it Mubei's turn. Instead, it was the bosun who first came into contact with a golden helmet. The bosun swung the harpoon in his hand like a windmill. His strength was great, and his moves were ferocious. At that time, he fought with the golden helmet and had a slight advantage. But in the eyes of the sea rabbit, there was a trace of puzzlement. These were all useless moves. With this level, he could stab a hole through him. Was it because he was too strong, or was it because others were too weak? Or perhaps Mubei actually had a different origin? In the end, the bosun still managed to kill the golden helmet with the help of the other origin power users. The process wasn't anything to compliment, as it wasn't clean at all. One of them had even suffered some minor injuries. Looking at their joyous expressions, the Sea Hare didn't know whether to laugh or not, or cry. With the first one, there was soon a second one after another. But there was no panic on the bow deck because there were still people who could kill golden helmets as if they were ordinary sea ghosts, and there was more than one of them. Facing the golden helmets that rushed up, the Sea Hare didn't treat them as a threat at all. If you couldn't kill them with one strike, it only meant that your strength wasn't enough, your timing wasn't right, your mentality wasn't stable, and your willpower wasn't strong enough. Although it was a golden helmet, its weakness was still the same. As long as you knew this, the rest didn't matter. Facing the 6 waving tentacles in the sky, the Sea Hare didn't back down. This was something that had penetrated deep into his bones, blood, and soul. It was as if there was nothing in the world that could make him feel reverence. Yes, of course, he couldn't do this when he was fighting Mubei, because that guy didn't back down just like him. In the midst of the 6 waving tentacles, he instantly found a gap and jumped forward, completely ignoring the damage that the tentacles might cause to his body. At the same time, he raised his right hand and stabbed the short spike in his hand deeply between the eyes of the golden helmet. This wasn't just strength, but also determination. It was a determination that didn't leave a way out for himself. If not for this, it would be a joke to break through the golden helmet's defense if one's strength couldn't penetrate it, and if one's heart couldn't reach it. Those origin power experts couldn't kill in one strike because of this. They always wanted to conserve their strength and retreat, and in the end, they ended up in a miserable state. This kind of determination was easy to say, but difficult to do. It required countless battles and countless life and death situations to cultivate. The golden helmet's brain was penetrated, and he was instantly powerless. The tentacles relied on inertia to whip his body, but in the end, they fell powerlessly, unharmed. Mubei was killed just as easily as him. Only at this point did he realize that it wasn't because the origin power of this world was so powerful, but because there was a clear and insurmountable difference between the 2 of them and the others. Because of the existence of the 2 of them, the attack of the golden helmet seemed aggressive, but it was always scary but not dangerous. This was the role of the cornerstone. With the two of them, there was an insurmountable barrier. The others had too many choices on both sides of the attack and defense. They did not need to use their bodies to go up because there were powerful companions behind them. Under such circumstances, the first wave of attacks from the Golden Helmet was successfully blocked. The only fly in the ointment was that there were still casualties. Not to mention ordinary people, even an origin power expert had died. Such a tragedy naturally couldn't happen at the bow, but the Golden Helmet's attacks on the two sides and the stern were quite effective. The Sea Widow shouted at him, "Rabbit, are you willing to go to the stern?" These two were very powerful, and it would be a waste for them to gather at the bow. But if they were separated, both of them would be in danger. She couldn't order Mubei around, so she could only give orders to the Sea Hare. She was also apprehensive because she didn't know if this fellow who had already revealed his rebellious nature would listen to her. She really couldn't do anything if he didn't. The Sea Hare's reply was straightforward. "Fine, but find me a couple of handy weapons first. I'm afraid the one I have won't be able to last much longer." Chapter 2045. The attacks of the sea ghosts started to become more intense. Everyone understood that there must be some kind of power behind this. The Ghost King was nearby. There was no mistake about it. A strange whistling sound started to surround the rock. This was a kind of strong sound wave interference. To the sea ghosts, it was a kind of mental crow's nest that could stimulate them to risk their lives even more. However, to the humans, it was a kind of mental torture, causing their reactions to be sluggish and causing them to hallucinate during the battle. The sea ghosts were still the main force, occasionally mixed with golden helmets. However, with the whistling of the Ghost King, the situation became more dangerous. The sea ghosts started to occupy the deck of the ship. They could no longer be stopped from the side. This was a watershed and also the prelude to the fall of the rock. Even the sea boss had joined the battle. Now, there was no longer a need for anyone to command the ship. Only the most primitive battle instinct was left. When fighting on the sea, the tragedy was that the loser had no way to escape. They could not surrender, nor could they scatter. Jumping into the sea to escape was a joke. Compared to swimming with sea creatures, even the most brainless person would understand the consequences. What was worse was that it was still winter. The crew and passengers were compressed in the middle of the cabin. The bow and stern of the ship had been lost. Now, they could only rely on the terrain to carry out a tight defense. At this point, the fall of the entire ship had become inevitable. Everyone understood this point. Their defense was somewhat tragic, and there were even people with weak wills who chose to give up. The Sea Widow was completely disheartened. She had never thought that this lucrative voyage would be her doomsday. Actually, it was inevitable when she thought about it carefully. After all, how many people would actually be able to live a smooth and peaceful life on the ocean? The more ocean-going the ship was, the more it was like this. Unless you never traveled far across the ocean and only moved around the mainland islands. Looking around, almost everyone in the surroundings had fallen into despair. They were only waving the weapons in their hands mechanically. Regardless of whether it was their mentality or physical strength, they were on the verge of collapse. Only two people, as usual, were killing the sea ghosts efficiently. Wherever there was a hole, they would fill it up. Just by looking at their movements, it was no different from when the battle started. The Sea Widow suddenly wanted to know, what exactly happened to this little fellow of hers? How could a person be reborn in such a short period of time? Squeezing to the side of the Sea Hare, she looked for an opportunity to ask, "Hare, can you tell me where you got your skills from?" The Sea Hare was somewhat speechless. Was this the time to think about such messy things? They were all stolen by the art of stealing. Like at night, I say, "Big sister, you have to boost the morale. If this goes on, everyone will be finished. No one will be able to escape." However, Widow High was indifferent. Dying in battle is nothing more than that. What else can we do? They're all tired. The Sea Hare reminded her, "Big sister, there's one thing you must know. The frequency of the golden armor bouncing up is going downhill. Although it's not obvious, as long as we persevere, we will definitely be able to last until the end. These things couldn't last for long because they were limited by their population. It's not endless. Sea Widow's heart skipped a beat. She had roamed the seas for 30 years and had experienced many storms and waves. But to be honest, this was the first time she had seen a golden-helmeted sea ghost. Her heart was filled with despair, and she had given up on herself. Because in history, there seemed to be no one who had survived the golden-helmeted sea ghosts led by the Ghost King. Although she was very confident, she was not arrogant enough to break the tradition of history. Therefore, she had this carelessness. However, after the sea hare's reminder, after a brief analysis, she discovered that the frequency of the golden-helmeted sea ghosts was not as high as before. This was a process. At the beginning of the battle, the golden-helmeted sea ghosts would appear. Then, they would appear one after another. When they were most concentrated, they would appear one after another. Every 10 breaths, there would be 7 or 8 of them jumping up. They were also retreating under such intensive attacks. However, the frequency of 7 or 8 every 10 breaths had already appeared for a very long time. Now that they carefully calculated, there were only 6 or 7 every 10 breaths. Although the pressure was still great because they were not defending on the side of the ship, the feeling was not very obvious. However, if this was a sign that the golden-helmeted sea ghosts were exhausted, it seemed that they really had the meaning to persevere. However, what about the Ghost King? The Ghost King hasn't made a move yet. If it really appears, how should we deal with it? The nearby Mube said in a muffled voice, "Old woman, how did you become a captain? Could it be that all your skills were obtained by lifting your skirt at night?" The Sea Ghost King had already made his move. It will not board the ship. Sea Widow instantly understood. The Sea Ghost King's attacks were mental attacks. This was the method that it was proficient in. However, it would not really jump onto the ship to kill. This was the characteristic of a high-level sea ghost. However, this guest tone was very unfriendly and also very dirty. However, she could not say anything because he was her patron. His strength was far above hers. He was someone that she could not offend. She clenched her teeth. Her desire to survive made her believe in these two people. She shouted sternly, "Everyone, put in more effort. The sea ghosts will not be able to hold on for much longer. I understand them. Their numbers are limited and they will not throw their entire race here. As long as we persevere for a while, victory will definitely belong to us." Regardless of whether they really listened to her or to try and get 2 more, the mood of the people on the ship was still somewhat raised. It could be foreseen that if the sea ghosts were to erupt in numbers again, this bit of morale would be instantly shattered. Fortunately, such a situation did not occur. Sea Hare discovered that the ordinary people on the ship were indeed very unbearable. Against the Golden Helmets, they basically could not be counted on to fight. However, none of the Origin Power users retreated. Every one of them performed very bravely, including the group of dancers. He and Mube were both intentionally or unintentionally protecting this group of people within the limits of their abilities. However, each of them paid attention to a different target. Sea Hare's focus was on not letting anything happen to Boss C. However, Mube's focus was placed on the dancers, especially the fattest one. Due to the inconvenience of her body, she was very clumsy when dealing with the 6 tentacles of the sea ghosts. Without Mube's help, this overly plump dancer would have already met with an accident. Was this an acquaintance? Or was it a unique taste? He looked at Mube in this way, and Mube also looked at him in the same way. There were so many young and lively dancers, yet he did not know how to curry favor with them. Instead, he cared about that middle-aged Sea Widow. He did not believe that this fellow was doing this for the future of the Dapeng. It was just a young man's perverted love for this mature body. Too useless. The two of them ridiculed each other, and the more they killed, the fiercer they became. Because of the clean, concise, and ruthless way of killing the ghosts, the two of them still had energy to spare. They were skillful, completely different from the others who were as tired as dogs. Under such a rhythm, although the number of sea ghosts that rushed onto the ship did not decrease, The number of golden helmets mixed among them was decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. This was exactly what old Sidafa had said. Although they were tired, they saw the hope of survival. Everyone began to become excited. Chapter 2046. Sea Hare walked on the slippery deck and watched as everyone excitedly cleaned the deck. The sea ghost attack this time had caused great damage to the great rock. The ship's hull was secondary, but the casualties were the biggest problem. Among the 100 people, almost 20 had died, and more than half of the remaining were injured. Most of the dead were crew members. After all, they had to stand at the front. This meant that for the rest of the voyage, everyone would have to do the work of 2 people. This was not a matter of a day or two, but a matter of months. People would go crazy if they had to work like this in the dry sea. Among the origin power users, the bosun and the other origin power user among the passengers had both lost their lives. Another 3 of the 8 dancers had died, and the sea rabbit noticed that the 3 who had died were the slimmest of them all. Additionally, the person who had fallen into the water before was also a willow, just like a hemp pole. Was body size related to death? Where did this logic come from? He could not figure it out at the moment. This was a terrible and bloody day. Not long after the battle ended, the Sea Widow made a decision. She decided to change her course and head towards an island supply point that was not part of the plan. This island was not on the route and would delay them for more than 20 days. Under normal circumstances, their next supply point would be 2 months later. However, it would be foolish to persist with the previous plan. Regardless of the loss of materials or the loss of personnel, they urgently needed to replenish their supplies. As for whether they could reach the central province on time, that was no longer the primary concern. The remaining dancers were not satisfied, but they could not persist. This was because the loss of sailors also determined the speed of the voyage, and this was not something that could be changed by the will of the people. Because they were sailing to the nearest island, the journey would take less than half a month. This meant that the ship's supplies could finally be used by Dafa. In order to boost morale after the near-death experience, Sea Widow appeared to be very Dafa in this aspect. Of course, these supplies were nothing to her. They were just water, wine, and food, and were not worth much. In order to store them for a longer time, even if they could not be used up, they would be replaced at the supply point. It was better to let the remaining people enjoy them. In any case, they would gain the reputation of Dafa, and it would make people feel that there was some meaning in fighting for their lives. The Sea Hare received special treatment, a large bucket of clear water. On the entire Great Rock, only he and Mubei received such treatment. Everything was fair and above board, and no one said anything. That was because 90% of the golden-helmeted sea ghosts were killed by the 2 of them. The remaining 10% were killed by the other origin power users, and they had lost 5 of their own. The disparity wasn't small at all. The 2 of them could be said to be the saviors of the entire ship, so shouldn't they receive some special treatment? After a busy day, the exhausted people had already fallen asleep. Only the bitter sailors still had to continue working. This was also the reason why the Sea Widow needed to find a place to dock. Victory could make people forget about their fatigue, but it would not last for long. After all, everyone was made of flesh, and there was a limit to their body and spirit. Sea Hare was not used to bathing. It was not because he did not like cleanliness, but because of the environmental conditions. As a sailor, no one had the habit of bathing. There was a quota for drinking, so how could he get used to it? Although he was not obsessed with cleanliness, he still desperately wanted to bathe at least once. This was because he had not bathed once in several months at sea. Everyone's daily cleanliness was achieved by fishing in the sea when the sea conditions were good. The next time they went into the sea, there would be a layer of salt, and they would need to wipe it off with a dry cloth. Only a sailor could endure this method, and ordinary people simply could not do it. In this battle, the sweat was secondary. The key was that he was covered in sea ghost juice. It was sticky and had a strange smell, making people feel very uncomfortable. Even someone like him who did not care about it could not endure it. A bucket of clear water was still not enough. So he first took a few buckets of seawater to wash. Finally, he used clear water to wash away the seawater, especially the important parts. He had a little premonition that something was going to happen, so he had to be clean, yes, polite. Finally, he wore a set of clean clothes and felt that his body had become lighter by a few kilograms. After leaving the cabin, he walked around and around, preparing to attend the banquet. It was Boss High's private banquet. This was not strange. With his skills on the ship, as the boss, how could he not know how to rope in and corrupt others? How did he get his position as the boss? There were very few people on the lower deck. They were either sleeping or drinking. This battle had connected the relationships of everyone on the ship, which was also an unexpected surprise. Having fought together before was the best glue that bound them together. However, on the spacious and empty deck, he found a familiar figure sneaking around. The person was carrying a big bucket, but it did not affect the person's nimble figure at all. After turning around, the person disappeared. The sea hare was just about to open his mouth and use his experience tonight to exchange for this guy's happiness, but he did not have the time to do so. There was no need to think. The person was carrying that bucket of clear water. Was he going to take a bath together? Or was it a one-on-many kind? He felt that he was very different from others, but being on the same ship as this guy, he always felt that his hands and feet were tied, and he was suppressed everywhere. He curled his lips, hesitated for a moment between peeping and using live ammunition. In the end, he decided to be happy first. Otherwise, the bath would be in vain. He swaggered into Boss High's cabin. This was also the most luxurious place on the rock. It was the boss's right. The lights in the cabin were dim, and shadows were everywhere. The gauze canopy was high, which made people fanciful. The table in the middle was not filled with fish and meat, but the most precious fruits and side dishes on the ship. It was not worth much on land, but on the sea, it was incomparably precious. Closing the door and bolting it, the sea widow was graceful and graceful. She did not have the slightest decisiveness of a boss. She was just a petite woman who had been widowed for a long time. She was very smart and knew what was the most fatal form for a young man. She was willing to pay the price, but she must achieve her goal. It was worth it. The two of them sat opposite each other. The sea widow smiled and filled 2 cups of wine, inviting him to drink. "Little rabbit, please drink this cup. Consider it my thanks to you." The sea hare smiled and drank it without hesitation. "Just a cup of wine, and Sister Sea sent me away?" The sea widow sighed in her heart. Actually, even at this time, she was still observing this guy's every move. If he was still in the same ignorant state as before, there was no need for her to make any sacrifices. It would be better to keep him hanging. But now, it seemed that it was not possible. This little guy had not only changed his fighting ability, but also something deeper. That kind of behavior could not be imitated. What kind of awakening could make a person change like this? But she also knew that to such a person, it was impossible to satisfy him with just words. She had to do something real. Fortunately, before she became old, she could still tie him down for at least 10 years. Then, what does Little Rabbit want? Chapter 2047. That night, the sea hare finally turned from a little rabbit to an old one. Early in the morning, he quietly slipped out of the cabin, feeling refreshed. Fortunately, he still knew his job. His master, Uncle Shrimp, had been on duty for a day. It was time to replace him. Uncle Shrimp looked at him and said nothing. He didn't know what to say either. Originally, he wanted to say that an old clam was the most taboo for a young man. Along the way, he would lose half of his life. However, as long as he thought of his disciple's performance in the battle, he couldn't say anything. His disciple was no longer his original disciple. The sea hare was gone forever. The sea hare inadvertently glanced at the sea in the distance. After making sure that nothing was wrong, it turned to the cabin below. It kept switching back and forth because it wanted to know whether that guy had finished his bath or not. He knew that guy was still inside. 5 dancers. How dare he? Sooner or later, he would die of exhaustion. He had made a decision in his heart. He would let this guy enjoy himself for a few days. Then, he would find an opportunity to challenge him. He wanted to see what this soft-footed shrimp could use to compete with him. A ship needed a strong person. The sea hare was enough. There was no need for another one. It wasn't until late in the morning, when it was almost time for lunch, that this guy walked out of the dancer's cabin. He didn't lean against the wall, nor did he spit. While walking, he stretched out his right hand and pointed his middle finger straight at the ship. The sea hare had an impulse to jump down and beat this guy up. However, it held back in the end. Now was not the time. This guy was still physically strong. Even if they fought, it would only be a battle of attrition. He wouldn't gain any advantage. This guy's action just now was directed at him. He knew it very well. Although he didn't know what that gesture meant, it was definitely not a good gesture. It was an insult. Yes, I did it. Come and find me if you have the ability. Too arrogant. After the attack of the sea ghosts, the whole voyage became peaceful. In the sea, these things were also the overlords. Wherever they passed, all the sea creatures, big and small, would hide far away, including the big fish on the ghost reefs. Everyone finally had a period of leisure. However, this leisure was only temporary. After this period of time, they would be back to normal after they had crossed this sea. Every day, Mube would take a bath and rinse her intestines every day. 7 days later, when they were close to the coast of the island, the sea rabbit found an opportunity to stir up trouble at the stern of the ship and had a hearty fight with her. Mube was as busy as always. Mube took a bath and rinsed her intestines every day. However, 7 days later, when they were close to the coast of the island and the sea conditions were more stable, the sea rabbit found an opportunity to stir up trouble at the stern of the ship and had a hearty fight. In this fight, they didn't try to cover it up. From sunrise to sunset, a few of the short thorns in their hands were broken, but no one could do anything to the other. One had a bloody nose and a swollen face, while the other had a crooked mouth and slanted eyes. The Sea Widow had no choice but to stop the others from heading toward the rear of the ship. She only watched from afar with a few origin power experts, and the sight of this caused her heart to palpitate and her body to break out in cold sweat. They had never seen such a life-and-death battle before. Both sides were unscrupulous, as if they were mortal enemies. However, no matter how vicious the methods were, the other side would always be able to deal with them, and then return the favor with even more vicious methods. They didn't dare to dissuade them for fear of accidentally injuring them. They didn't see much from watching the two of them slaughter the golden-helmeted sea ghosts. They only knew that they attacked quickly and swiftly and never wasted a second time. However, only when these two fought did they know what a real battle was. At this level, they might not be any different from the golden-helmeted sea ghosts. In the end, they couldn't fight anymore. The dancers carried Mube and left, while the Sea Widow retreated with the rabbit on her back. No one was left behind. The Sea Rabbit realized that she had misjudged the situation. Even if that guy stayed in the cabin every night, his physical strength wasn't inferior to hers at all. It seemed that it would be very difficult to win against the other party in this aspect. She had to find another method. Of course, she wasn't weak either. That guy wanted to win against her, but there was no way. Before she found a way, it wouldn't be good to cause any more trouble. After all, the battle between the two was too intense. If she wasn't careful, an accident could happen at any time. After a few more days, they finally saw their destination. It was a big island called Middle Sand. The Sea Widow wasn't unfamiliar with this place, but she didn't like it. This was because this was a pirate's paradise. It was lawless, chaotic, and the strong ruled. It was a so-called land of freedom. When she was rising, she would often come here to look for opportunities. However, after she made a name for herself, she rarely came here again. After all, the people here didn't like to walk the righteous path. This time, there was no other way. She needed supplies. She needed to repair the damage to the hull during the battle. Most importantly, she needed a group of experienced sailors. Although she knew that the skills of the sailors here might not be a problem, but it would be difficult to discipline them. However, there were two dumb worms on the ship. Who would be afraid of them not being obedient? These two people would challenge each other to a life-and-death battle at the slightest provocation. It was really a headache. From the ship to the land, it was a paradise for people who had been in the sea for a long time. The Sea Widow repeatedly warned them not to be nosy. She asked them to return to the ship and rest at night. Otherwise, she wouldn't be responsible for anything that happened. This was also because of her misgivings about Middle Sand Island. The people here might know her reputation, but who would care about the sailors and guests under her? She couldn't keep an eye on them all day. There were still a lot of problems that needed to be solved. After 7 or 8 days of repeated warnings, a problem still occurred. It was a mother and son. The child was about 10 years old. Why did they not hesitate to cross the ocean to Middle Continent? There was no need to think about the story behind this. Every tragedy was different. The mother and son sold their family property to board this ship. They didn't have much money left. They could only live frugally. They relied on washing clothes to maintain the ship's consumption. There weren't many guests on the ship, so everyone knew about the mother and son situation. After the battle with the sea ghosts, there were actually some gains. For example, the sea ghost core stone was a relatively precious medicinal material on the market. It could be sold for some money. When cleaning the battlefield, the core stones of the golden helmeted sea ghosts were collected by the sailors on the ship. They were then distributed to the force users who contributed in the battle. However, because there were too many ordinary sea ghosts, they didn't handle them very cleanly. Of course, the rich people wouldn't dirty their hands for such a small amount of money. There weren't many poor people who could afford to board this ocean-going ship. Therefore, with everyone's tacit consent, the mother and son cut off some ordinary sea ghost core stones and prepared to find an opportunity to sell them. In any case, they would be able to survive this difficult journey. Middle Sand Island was an opportunity. If they sold the sea ghost core stones for some money, they would at least be able to cover the expenses along the way. At the same time, they wouldn't have to accept the charity of others on the ship every now and then. This mother had a very strong personality. Everyone understood that, so they gave her this opportunity. This was where the problem came from. The mother went ashore alone and tried to sell her core stones in the port market where good and bad people mixed together. As a woman who was slightly beautiful and didn't know much about the harsh environment, she simply couldn't avoid trouble when she was faced with the most complicated interpersonal relationships in the port. In order to sell a dozen or so core stones, she almost sold herself to a brothel. Chapter 2048. There is no need to delve into the details of the process. How many of those fellows at the port were honest? For a single mother, it was too easy for her to deceive her son. The Seahorse restaurant was such a club. Although it was called a restaurant, the food was actually quite ordinary. It was enough for the sailors who had been sailing for a long time. If the food was too exquisite, these boorish people might not be able to taste it. The key was the other parts of the Seahorse restaurant. This was the main reason why the sailors were willing to throw away their hard-earned money here. They were all hot-blooded youths in their prime. Who wouldn't like such a thing? This single mother was tricked into coming here by one of the restaurant's subordinates under the guise that there was a customer who was willing to buy her sea ghost core stone at a high price. It was very simple and practical. It would be difficult for this mother to leave after she came here. As usual, she was beaten up and tortured. There were countless ships coming and going from the port. Where would they find a missing person? They were all ships, and no one would delay their journey for 1 or 2 people. They could only sigh helplessly if they couldn't find her after a rough search. Once the ship she was on left, this woman would be stuck here forever. She would live a miserable life of serving others for the rest of her life. She would be infected with many pimples and diseases until she grew old and no longer had any customers. And she would be thrown out to be buried in a foreign land. This was how the women of the Seahorse restaurant came to be. They didn't catch native islanders because it was too troublesome. They specialized in tricking passing women because they were the weaker group. Fortunately, the 5 dancers were also here. They weren't here to dine, and of course, they weren't here to be guests. They were here to buy people. They had come with 9 people to congratulate the Emperor of Central Plains, but now there were only 5 left. They couldn't even gather enough dancers for a group dance. This was a great discourtesy, so they needed to add a few more. Time was tight, so they could only find one at the port. They didn't have any better choices apart from such an occasion. Since he was an Origin power user, he didn't have to worry about being scammed by these filthy places. He couldn't find a suitable one after searching through several places, so he decided to find the Seahorse House and meet this pitiful mother there. The outcome wasn't too bad. The 5 dancers had made a decisive move after sharing weal and woe on the Great Rock, as well as the fate of this mother who had washed their clothes for them without complaint. They didn't use force, but instead paid 10 times the price to redeem her. That was the limit of their strength. If they were to use force, the Seahorse Tower would summon all the Origin power experts in the port to help. This wasn't something they could handle with their meager strength. He felt a little sullen, but fortunately, he hadn't made a big mistake yet. For the sake of her child, she could only swallow her humiliation, pick up her courage, and force herself to be cheerful. In this regard, a woman's endurance was always better than a girl's. She wasn't the first victim here, and she definitely wouldn't be the last. When habits became rules, everyone was no longer surprised by ugliness. This wasn't a problem of a single person or place, but of the entire port and the entire Middle Sand Island. The Sea Hare only heard the news the next day, and he was not too indignant. He was not the kind of person who was full of a sense of justice, but what was a little implicated was that his clothes seemed to have been washed at that woman's place in exchange for food and water during the voyage. So, there was still a connection. He wasn't someone who would pretend nothing had happened after suffering a loss. So, he went to the Seahorse House for a meal. Perhaps he didn't bring money, or perhaps he had forgotten, but he didn't pay and was still picky. His mouth wasn't clean either, and he acted as if he was giving her face by eating here. He even asked for takeout. No one could stand such a scoundrel. Did he come here to dine and dash? The port was full of crooks and honest people, and drunken sailors were everywhere. They thought that they didn't care about anyone who had gone through the ups and downs of the sea. However, the people in the port wouldn't tolerate such a problem. There were many such corpses on the wasteland outside the dock. They were all left behind by the brave sailors. For these people, the port would clearly inform the ship's owner and wouldn't even try to hide it. This was a very common thing in Middle Sand Harbor. It happened almost every day. Ships coming from the south to the north would bring all kinds of sailors, but they would repeat the same story. First, they would be rude, then they would quarrel, then they would push and shove, escalate to fists, and finally pull out their weapons and ignore them. This time, the process was no different. The only difference was that this troublesome sailor was a bit difficult to deal with. First, it was the Seahorse House's workers and thugs. Then, it was the neighbors next to them. Almost half of the street's people who made a living here had rushed over. Although they were in a competitive relationship with each other, they had to maintain a united front. They had to show Zhongsha Port's toughness. This was their bottom line. A small fight turned into a big fight. From the first floor to the third floor. All the valuables in the Seahorse House were basically smashed into pieces. Very few of them were intact. Everything that could be swung was used as a weapon and thrown everywhere. Calligraphy and paintings were torn to pieces. Utensils were scattered all over the floor, and tables and chairs were not intact. They were either missing a leg or a corner. Even the windows were turned into holes. This was not a fight. It was a smashing and looting. The ordinary people had long since hidden far away. The only thing left was the siege of nearly 100 Origin power users in Middle Sand Harbor. It was useless. Sea Hare didn't kill people. After reaching a certain level, it didn't make a difference whether or not an expert like him had a weapon in his hand. The only thing he could do was to break his arms and legs, or fall down from a building and become half-crippled. He smashed things very slowly. For half a day, it was as if he was deliberately waiting for more people to come. He waited until no one came forward. In the end, the trembling chef made a whole set of sumptuous dishes for him and put it in a food box. He even had to send a servant to carry it and follow behind. The Sea Hare was very satisfied with this free meal. This was a lesson. Of course, there was nothing to hide. Besides, it was impossible to completely hide your whereabouts in other people's territory. In his consciousness, everything was done naturally. He didn't know when it started, but there were many things that he no longer cared about. He had a feeling of looking down on others. This kind of confidence was also one of his changes. He didn't know where it came from. The harbor was in a mess. Countless people were trying to find out who this person was. Which ship did he belong to? What was the secret purpose behind doing this? After asking around, the final conclusion was that he was doing this for a woman with a single parent. Was it necessary? Sea Hare returned to the ship at noon. He took a good bath and then began to take an afternoon nap. He was carefree. But at noon, another guy who had eaten and drunk to his heart's content came back. The harbor was very big. He was on the other side of the harbor, so he got the news a little later. Chapter 2049. When the Sea Hare woke up from his afternoon nap with satisfaction, he saw through the porthole that the sky above the harbor was exceptionally beautiful. Pieces of burning clouds were constantly surging, and he could even feel a trace of heat. At dusk, the burning clouds could actually burn him to the point where he could feel the heat. The Sea Hare flipped over and rushed to the deck, only to see raging flames surging in one direction of the harbor. The flames soared high, and everywhere there was a crowd of people running like wolves and rushing like boars. They were shouting for water while using buckets to put out the fire. It was a mess. What was going on? Looking at the direction, it seemed to be the direction of the seahorse house, but he could not see clearly. The harbor of Zhongsha Island was very prosperous, and there were rows upon rows blocking his line of sight. It had nothing to do with him, so he just leaned on the side of the ship to watch the excitement. As he watched, a familiar figure rushed over, and one after another, the other crew members on the ship returned. Not only were there the original old people, but there were also more than 20 newly recruited sailors. The Sea Hare smiled as he watched the Sea Hare rush to the deck and angrily walk towards him. He did not know that he was going to die, so he showed an innocent smile, but he was pushed into the cabin by the Sea Widow, who scolded him. "I'll get you two into trouble. After doing such a big thing, you still have the mood to sleep here and watch the excitement?" The Sea Hare was very aggrieved. "What big thing? What does it have to do with me? Big sister, you can't invert black and white and slander people." The Sea Widow reached out and grabbed the hare's ear. "Didn't you go to the seahorse house this morning to smash and rob? The entire third floor was almost torn down by you. Countless legs and arms were injured, and you dare say that you didn't do it?" The Sea Hare looked indifferent. "Isn't it just a fight? Who doesn't have an impulsive time? But I didn't set the fire, and I didn't kill anyone. I already restrained myself. Isn't such a situation very common in a place like the harbor?" The Sea Widow was somewhat flustered. "You didn't set the fire, but you made a bad start. That Mubei came back at noon and heard about it. As a result, he went to the seahorse house again and smashed it again. People found people to stop him, but he directly killed them. He killed until the seahorse house flowed with blood. That's not all. Before he left, he set the house on fire and burned it clean. You said that this has nothing to do with you?" The Sea Rabbit was a little stunned. "Isn't this guy too reckless? This wasn't me who encouraged him to go. It was him who went crazy. What's more, big sister, you also know about my relationship with him. How could he possibly listen to me? Perhaps it was instigated by those dancers." After they suffered a loss, they felt embarrassed and started gossiping in front of their gigolo to fan the flames. Seeing Widow Hai's anxious face, he was very concerned. "Why don't we go over and pretend to help put out the fire? At the very least, it was an attitude. We can't let people think that the people on the Great Rock are unreasonable. We also have compassion." Sea Widow stomped her feet in anger. "You're going to extinguish the fire? Or are they there to gloat? Aren't you afraid that others will blame it on you and vent their anger on your life?" The Sea Hare smiled. "Taking it out on me? They had to have the ability to do so. At worst, I'll do what Mubei did again. Do you think I can't kill people?" Sea Widow Hai was bitter and turned to leave. The Sea Hare was still shouting behind her. "Big sister, where are you going?" Sea Widow Hai didn't even look back. "Gather people and run." This old lady is dead because of you two troublemakers. Don't even think about resupplying from this sea region in the future." The great rock quickly gathered the sailors and fled under the cover of the night. Fortunately, most of their supplies had been replenished, and there was nothing too urgent to wait for. The pursuers from Zhongsha port arrived somewhat late. Not because they were slow, but because a portion of the origin power experts at the port had their limbs broken, and a portion of them had gone to see the King of Hell. With these two vicious people on the Great Rock, no one dared to rashly stop them unless they gathered enough strength and found a comparable expert. They could only watch as the Great Rock left, and they didn't even have the courage to chase after them. In the chaotic order, the bigger fist was the rule. The sea hare looked at the sullen sea widow high and patted her with a round of meaty waves. "Why are you so worried? By the time they understand, places like this will only be more afraid of the Great Rock. I can guarantee that this will leave an impression in Zhongsha that won't be erased for decades. This is a good thing." Sea Widow High turned her back to him. "The next time we dock, neither of you can think about getting off the ship and having fun." The Great Rock once again set out on its journey. Because of this turn, they would be delayed for at least a month, but it was all worth it. At the very least, everyone had recovered from the sea ghost attack. Why did you have to kill those people? There was no need at all? After arriving at the passenger cabin, he couldn't help but look for this cruel fellow again. This person definitely had a lot of secrets, a lot of stories. This was his intuition. Uncharacteristically, Mubei opened his mouth this time. The dancers did the right thing, because those evildoers won't hold a grudge because of this transaction. My method is also correct, because those who hold a grudge are already dead, and the others will at least restrain themselves for a period of time. You're the only one who can do this. Do you think that these disabled people will turn over a new leaf? No, they will only become worse. You helped one, but you left behind a hidden danger for countless passengers who will stay at Zhongsha port in the future. They will only be more hidden, more cruel. Sea Hare didn't refute, because his decision was actually a compromise, a collision of ideas between his former self and his current self. In fact, in his life, he really hadn't killed anyone. But his new idea required him to kill, so there was the scene at Seahorse Tower. He knew that maybe Mubei and his current idea was right, but he needed time to adapt. So far, his behavior had been natural, conforming to the sudden change in his mind, feeling that it was more pleasant to do things this way, more in line with his nature, but he really wanted to know why. The change came too suddenly, so suddenly that as long as it was a normal person, they would doubt the root cause of all this. He wasn't swayed by those strange thoughts. He was still struggling and resisting. After obtaining certain abilities, he still wanted to know the reason behind them. In the past 20 years, his life experience was too pale, and he didn't have the opportunity to see and understand the deep things of human nature. He needed time. He needed to slowly break in before he could truly integrate his former self and his current self into one. Mubei looked at him with great interest. "Are you confused? Do you need me to give you some advice? I have a lot of stories in my life. It's like I've been dreaming. But the premise is that you have to fight with me. Fight once. If you don't die, I will tell you one of my stories. But I want to remind you that my only purpose in fighting is to kill the other side, and you are no exception. Since we have fought twice, I will pay the interest first. First, I will tell you 2 stories. If you're interested, can you decide whether to continue? Well, what should I tell you? First, tell me the story of a phoenix, then tell me the story of a fox." Chapter 2050. The Rock embarked on a new voyage. Among the sailors that Sea Widow had recruited this time, there was also an experienced lookout to partner with Uncle Shrimp. This was to free up the people that Sea Widow had recruited. Her purpose was to keep this powerful fighter by her side so that she could deal with possible dangers at any time. Danger was everywhere, not only from the sea, but also from inside the Dapeng. The main problem was the new 20 sailors, which was unavoidable. When a ship recruited a large number of people, especially those who were not familiar with them, Sea Widow was limited by the situation of the Dapeng, so she had to recruit people halfway in the Middle Sand Island. What kind of sailors could come from such a place? She did not have time to screen, especially because of the quarrel between the two at the end. There was no other way. She hadn't come to Zhongsha for many years, so she relied on her old connections to gather sailors. If she relied on herself to recruit people, she wouldn't be able to find anyone she liked in a few months, so she didn't have to worry. These sailors were gathered through an intermediary, the Maritime Merchant Union. She was very clear that her old connections wouldn't be of much use. In a place like Zhongsha Island, the darkness didn't only lie in those despicable places, but also in organizations like the Maritime Merchant Union. But for a foreign ship without the Sea Merchant Union, she could not even recruit a single person. This was the reason why she had to free Sea Hare. Mu Bei was also very powerful, but he was a guest, so she was not qualified to give orders. Alas, during this voyage, she had to feed Sea Hare carrots. It did not matter. She was not disgusted, especially when she felt that Sea Hare was becoming more and more like a real man. If the Dapeng eventually became a husband and wife, she would have no objection, but she knew that this guy's ambition was not here. With her age, she could not keep such a person, so she could only take one step at a time. Sea Hare had been living a very comfortable life since the beginning of the new voyage. He had the title of bosun, but in reality, he was an adulterous gigolo. This was known by everyone on the ship, just like Mu Bei, who stayed in the dancer's cabin all day long. The old people had no objection to this, because they had personally experienced the strength of these two people. In this world, strength was privilege, including women. As for whether the newcomers were convinced or not, it was another matter. The real commander of the sailors was another person, an old sailor who was proficient in sea affairs. Most of the time, the Sea Hare followed behind her lover as a bodyguard. She encouraged him during the day and cheered him on at night. Of course, another thing that was even more meaningful to him was listening to stories. Mu Bei's stories had a special characteristic, and that was that they were all mythical stories. The characters in the stories were always coming and going, changing constantly. A single sword strike could destroy the stars, and a single spell could cause the sun and moon to lose their light. They were not from the mortal world at all. He had never heard of or seen any celestial being before. It was completely out of touch with reality, but he had to admit that it was very pleasant to listen to and also contained a very deep meaning. After listening to one would want to listen to another. For this, he had put in a lot of effort. In the rear cargo hold of Dapeng, he had opened up a relatively empty space. Very few people came here. Once they locked it up, no one would be able to come in. This was the price he had to pay for wanting to listen to the story. Actually, listening to the story was only one of the reasons. Personally, he also liked this kind of life and death game. He knew that this was not good. If he developed this kind of habit, sooner or later he would die from his desire to win. However, he could not control himself. He was especially obsessed with the feeling of fighting. There were also many stories. It started with the phoenix, then the heavenly fox, the wild boar. Then it began to talk about a sword sect. He forgot the name, but there were many amazing people in it. Later on, it began to talk about the filth of the immortal court, mutual deception, and very profound internal conflicts. Are these stories all made up by you? If that's the case, you shouldn't practice martial arts. You should write Shinsha novels. Mu Bei glanced at him and said disdainfully, "This is not made up. It's all true. You may not have experienced it, but you can't deny its existence. With your little knowledge, you can't even tell what's in the mortal world, let alone something of a higher level." The Sea Hare was also laughing. Even if it's true, can you not change the main character to yourself? You are so powerful, immortal to heaven and earth, a person who exists with the sun and moon. How can you stay on this broken ship and mingle with a mortal like me? Moreover, after fighting, it seems like you can't win against me. Why don't you fly 2 steps for me to see? And it's not far. If you fly from this pile of goods to that, I will believe you. Mu Bei was dismissive of his suspicions and was not in the mood to be angry with him. In these days of contact, they had fought many times, but no one could do anything to the other. It was useless to fight. Moreover, this kid's mouth was sinister and vicious. He had already experienced enough. What was there to be angry with an ant? I told you I've been dreaming. This is my dreamland. I'm a master of this place. In this place, I am an eternal existence, the most powerful existence. You, on the other hand, are nothing more than a broken memory in the dream, a randomly generated and unreal existence. Saying that you're a pile of shit is an overstatement. At least the shit is still real, and you are just a product of imagination. The sea hare laughed. Your scolding is very creative. But I just want to know, why can't you do anything to a pile of shit? You are the most powerful? Then what about me? Mube was also somewhat puzzled. This was the only thing he could not explain. In theory, it should not be. How could there be an existence as powerful as him here? The sea hare was still there. I say, old Mube, your dream is quite good. 5 old women. I was wondering why there was no effect at all. So it was a dream. I just want to ask, when you wake up, will your efforts be broken? Mube looked at him coldly and did not speak. Instead, he turned around and found a long box. He opened it, and there were 2 weapons quietly placed inside. Do you dare to compete with this? The sea hare came up to take a look. He recognized this thing. It was 2 swords. The sailors on the ship did not like to use this thing. It was somewhat long and not suitable for use on the ship. It was also very inconvenient in the water. It was the favorite weapon of the strong people on land. Mube narrowed his eyes. 2 swords exactly the same. You choose first. If you can still walk out of the door of the cargo hold alive, I will tell you some of the true secrets of the heavens. The sea hare slowly stretched out his hand and held one of the swords. A very familiar feeling was transmitted to his heart, as if this was not a sword, but an extension of his hand. He had always thought that he was best at short thorns, but he did not expect that the thing that had truly fused into his blood and soul was this thing. What secret of the heavens? It was just the wild imagination of a madman. Good. You have to think clearly. If you really use a sword, it is hard to say who can walk out of this door. Chapter 2051. The people on the ship would never know what happened in the cargo hold at the bottom of the ship. It was not 2 people, but 2 balls of light. Stab, hack, slice, chop, point, wipe, lift, flick. The 2 swords displayed abilities that shouldn't have appeared in the mortal world, but the people involved didn't know it. They had already fallen into an intoxicated frenzy, and nothing could pull them apart. This battle was earth-shattering. From the beginning, they were evenly matched, and in the end, they were evenly matched. The sea rabbit did not understand. In her senses, this was a part of her body. He was the sword, and the sword was her. How could she use her best sword skills and still not do anything to this guy? Mube was also very helpless. Now, this was his true ability. It was completely different from a method of killing people at the harbor. This was the inheritance of a sword immortal, the supreme offensive method in the universe. Yet it was still a draw. In his subconscious, even if a real sword immortal descended to the mortal world, he would definitely not be able to withstand his sharp attacks. But everything that happened here was so illusory, so unreal. Was he in a dream? Or was he not in a dream? He was doubting himself. After a battle, both of them were somewhat depressed. They did not achieve their goals. They needed to consider what was going on. Before the sea rabbit left, she waved the sword in her hand. This thing, are you giving it to me? Mube waved his hand. What else could he do? This guy was really difficult to deal with. Moreover, to someone who could be on par with him in terms of sword skills, no matter who it was, he respected him from the bottom of his heart. It was not respect for the person, but respect for the sword. Take it away. Tomorrow, I will tell you a story about the sky, a story that an ant like you will never be able to imagine. The sea rabbit curled her lips, disdain in her heart. This person had the ability, but his brain was not normal. But he was also not normal now. When he held the sword, it was as if he was holding another world. That feeling was so strong. But he was unable to remove the veil between him and that world. He knew that Mube was not normal. But now he realized that he was also not normal. Mu Bei said that he was living in a dream, and if what he said was true, then didn't that mean that he was also in someone else's dream? Was it his own dream? Or was it someone else's dream? Was it possible for two people to meet and greet each other in their dreams? Could they even fight with swords? They could even peep together? Even if he was an inexperienced person, he knew that such a thing was too inconceivable. But he couldn't figure out what had happened. Could it be that he was going to spend the rest of his life in a muddle-headed manner? He did not believe that there was such a thing as awakening in this world. There was nothing that could turn an ordinary person, an orphan who spent his days on a ship and never fought, into a powerhouse overnight. There wasn't even a process. In the blink of an eye, without any physical training or life and death experiences, without anything at all, a bottom-level sailor could become a powerhouse, and a powerhouse among powerhouses at that. Such an unimaginable thing could only be done in a dream, and only then could one ignore the laws of reality. In other words, what Madman Mu Bei said could be true. This was really a dream. Not only Mu Bei, but also him. This included every single one of them. Otherwise, there was no way to explain why no one was surprised by his transformation. He pinched himself. He had flesh and blood. Yet he was in a dream? He realized that he was about to go crazy. If it was a dream, what would happen after he woke up? Would he become an immortal like Madman Mu Bei said? Or would he become a muddle-headed sea rabbit again? He didn't know. If he had to choose, he wouldn't want to become a sea rabbit again. Perhaps the worst thing in the world was not dreaming, but knowing that you were dreaming but never being able to go back. The worst thing was you seemed to be awake. The sea rabbit was somewhat absent-minded, but in a corner of the Da Peng, several sailors were secretly plotting. They were all new sailors, and just as the Sea Widow had expected, the sailors of Middle Sand Island were not as simple as they seemed. This was not just a matter of forming cliques, nor was it a matter of personality flaws, but a deeper scheme. Sea Widow had not come to Zhongsha Island for many years, and the old favor she had for him was long gone. The reason why the Sea Merchant Union helped him this time, without any discount, was actually because of a deeper reason. The centenary birthday of the Emperor of Zhongzhou was just a superficial reason for various places to send tributes to Zhongzhou. The details were much more important than the birthday itself. It involved the changes in the world structure, the future distribution of benefits, and so on. Zhongsha Island also wanted to go to Zhongsha Island, but the people of Zhongsha Island tended to think like bandits, so it would be very painful for them to offer a huge gift. Therefore, they set their sights on the ships that came and went. However, such targets were not easy to find. The chances of them intercepting another ship in the vast sea, and they also had to carry precious tributes, were quite low. Zhongsha Island had a bad reputation, so the envoys of the islands who were going to pay tribute would not stop here to resupply, and their course was also kept a secret. This made it very difficult for the people of Zhongsha Island to achieve their goal of borrowing a chicken to lay eggs. Just when they were at their wits' end, the arrival of the Da Peng provided them with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Stop, resupply, and replenish the sailors. This was truly a heaven-sent opportunity. There was a path to heaven, but you chose to throw yourself into the gates of hell. The best method wasn't to attack at the port because there were too many merchant ships docked here. Even if the people of Zhongsha Island were bandits, they wouldn't dare to attack openly in broad daylight. If that were the case, no one would dare to dock here, and the decline of Zhongsha Island would be even greater. The heavens had opened their eyes. Since the Da Peng had encountered a sea ghost tide, it was a heaven-sent opportunity for them to replenish their crew. 20 or so sailors were enough to completely overturn the situation at sea. Murdering and robbing the ship, along with the tributes, was simply too perfect. For this reason, Zhongsha Island had gathered the most outstanding origin power experts in the port and stationed them on the Da Peng. A dozen or so origin power experts, including several from Zhongsha, were all famous characters in the sea region. This kind of deployment was absolutely foolproof. They would be able to act according to plan after a certain distance out to sea. The actions of the sea hare in Mu Bei were too sudden, and the Da Peng had fled the port that very night. As such, these origin power experts had no knowledge of these two giant insects. But during these days on the Dapeng, they had gradually come to understand the composition of the Dapeng's strength through their interactions with the elders. These people had boasted about the sea hare and Mu Bei as if they were heavenly and earthly existences, but this was nothing in the ears of these professional bandits. Capable people wouldn't easily believe in rumors, and they would rather believe in their own eyes. They were just two somewhat powerful origin power experts. As for saying that they could slaughter the golden-helmeted sea ghosts like dogs, that was just an exaggeration. Such exaggerations could be found everywhere at sea and weren't at all new. Chapter 2052. The voyage after leaving Middle Sand Island had been relatively smooth. After a dozen or so days, they were already far away from Middle Sand Island and on their way to Central Continent. This was also the time for these spies to make their move. They couldn't be delayed too far. That was because they would have to change ships and replenish their crew after they succeeded. They couldn't possibly rely on these Crescent sailors to continue the journey. Moreover, the large fox head on Rock's bow would also expose their identity as bandits. If they made their move here, they would meet up with another ship from Middle Sand Island and take over their journey to Central Continent. Everything was going according to plan. 15 of the 26 newly recruited sailors were origin power users, and 4 of them were the strongest. Each of them had their own unique skills and were well known throughout the Ghost Sea. They were genuine experts who had experienced the test of time and weren't fake experts who could boast about their abilities after only 1 or 2 battles. The ship was only so big, so there was no need to talk about tactics. It was fine as long as they could make sure they could attack at the same time. The main point was to divide and surround the enemy. Currently, there were 9 origin power users and 6 passengers on Rock. They were Mu Bei, 5 dancers, and 3 crew members, Sea Widow, the first mate, and Sea Hare. In such a seizing of the ship, the passengers would generally not intervene. They would do their best to fight against the sea monsters because it was related to their own safety. However, in the battle between the pirates and the crew, they would generally remain neutral. No matter who obtained the control of the ship, the voyage would always continue. It would not hinder their purpose. Hence, a portion of the force was used to restrain the passengers, while the main force was used to eliminate those 3 people. This was a very simple matter. 15 origin power users on board the ship was already quite sufficient in terms of manpower. This was especially true for those 2 so-called experts who were the focus of the Middle Sand Pirates. They set the time to be at night. Not only could they catch the enemy off guard, they could also determine their location. For example, Widow High and her lover would definitely be fooling around in the cabin, one after the other. Their guess wasn't wrong. Sea Hare was full of energy and couldn't stay up all night. During this period, even someone as experienced as Sea Widow couldn't withstand it and could only grit her teeth and endure. It was just that they didn't know why this brat's energy seemed to be endless. Those newcomers have been behaving themselves, but the more they're like this, the more worried I am. The Middle Sand sailors are not that honest. If they suddenly become honest, it can only mean that they have already formed an organization. Hey, Rabbit, can you not put your energy on me every day? You should at least take some time out to check on their movements. After all, you're a bosun. You can't just sit here and soak in the hot spring every day, right? Sea Widow felt weak all over, but at least she could still complain with her mouth. This fellow was getting more and more out of hand. He had been spoiled like a big boss and did not care about anything. He only knew how to stroll around during the day and gather seafood at night. The Sea Hare turned over in satisfaction. Chasing the sea was the best hypnotic. It could make him fall asleep quickly, and the quality of his sleep was particularly high. He wouldn't even dream. What are you looking at? Why are you looking for trouble with him? You have to believe that most of them are kind. As for what they are scheming, the most they can do is to rob this broken ship. When that time comes, they can just kill him. It's such a simple matter. Why do they have to make it so complicated? Sea Widow was speechless and did not know what to say. When a person's martial strength had surpassed a certain limit, some of the so-called considerations would be meaningless. This was the change in perspective brought about by the difference in level. Before she could say anything, the heavy cabin door was suddenly violently slammed open. A figure with a cold glint pounced towards the big bed. There were 4 figures following behind him. 5 of the main characters who attacked the rock had come at once. It could be said that they had thought highly of them. Sea Widow's tiredness seemed to have been doused with ice water. She immediately realized what had happened. Ignoring the fact that her body was exposed, she turned over and was about to roll to the side of the bed. At the same time, she kicked the dead rabbit. While receiving the reaction force, she could also wake the dead rabbit up. However, her reaction was after all too slow. She needed time to react from her dazed state. Under the opponent's meticulously prepared quick attack, she was powerless. She also did not have a suitable weapon in her hands. In the next moment, she felt her body lighten. The wide quilt was wrapped around the black figure that was pouncing towards her. Under the quilt, 2 lumps of flesh could be seen. One was white and the other was black. Dead man. Although Sea Widow was shrewish, she was still unable to react in such a way. She saw the dead rabbit feel around under the pillow. A long sword that was much longer than the short thorn appeared in his hand. He very naturally stabbed it into the quilt. The thick silk quilt was immediately soaked in blood. Following that, the rabbit's body went limp and fell onto the bed. Sea Widow finally had time to roll under the bed. Her left hand tore off a piece of the bed sheet to wrap around her body, while her right hand skillfully pulled out a short thorn from under the bed. She had decades of experience on the sea. She was not a woman who relied on luck to climb up. When she stood up again, she realized that everything had ended. Just when she was still busy covering her body, 5 figures fell one after another in the narrow cabin. Only a black body with a sword in his hand was looking at her amusedly. I say, Big Sister C, this is not a good habit of yours. What time is it now, and you're still thinking about the bed sheet? Sea Widow was still in shock. She scolded, "You damned rabbit, you scared me to death. Have they started to make their move?" Sea Hare slowly began to put on his clothes. "Let's go out and take a look. Each and every one of them. They can't even let us sleep in peace." The attack of the Middle Sand Pirates was destined to fail from the start. There was only one result. The pitiful first mate was killed, and that was it. There were 7 or 8 people guarding outside the main cabin of the dancers. They were responsible for monitoring them, while the people inside were sleeping peacefully. Sea Hare was very angry. He purposely held back during the fight and forced these people into the main cabin. He also wanted to take the opportunity to sneak in and see how the 5 demons fought together. However, he was forced out by a sword light. "Since you're my cabin, it's my business. Sea Hare, I'm warning you, don't even think about coming in to take advantage of me." The entire process did not cause much of a commotion, and most people were still asleep. Everything was already over, but Sea Widow still had many things to do. She needed to stabilize and control the ordinary sailors who weren't origin power users. Threatening, suppressing, and intimidating them were all her business. The first mate was already dead, and no one could help her. As for that damned rabbit, he could not be counted on. It could be said that this failed attempt to seize the ship was because they had encountered people they could not understand. However, the Sea Hare knew that there were a number of troublesome people in this group, and that they definitely weren't ordinary origin power users. The Sea Widow couldn't sense this, but only someone like her who had experienced the situation knew that these ambushers possessed some strength. Chapter 2053. This world is the lowest level world. In the sky, there are the rules of the universe. Mu Bei continued to tell the story. To him and the sea rabbit, the threat from humans on this route was far less than the threat from nature. There are many things that can't be said, because the heavens have rules in the dark to restrict the words and actions of humans. But the heavens will not punish you for talking in your sleep. That is why you can hear stories here that you will never hear in the outside world. When I talk in my dream, you listen in your dream. When we wake up, we scatter. I don't know what I said, and you have long forgotten what you have heard. It will not affect the heavens' operation. The sea rabbit laughed. According to what you said, the people you and I killed, we did not really kill them. It's just a way to leave the dream world. If we want to leave the dream world, is there only one way? Mu Bei's expression was bleak. Maybe. First, you have to believe that this is a dream. Then you will consciously find a way to leave. But who will believe that this is a dream? We have flesh and blood, feelings and women. She can even give birth to your child. No one will believe it. It is precisely because no one believes that the dream is real enough. Do you believe it? The sea rabbit was touched. Life is originally a dream. How can you tell that you are in a dream? Or outside the dream? Is there outside the dream? Or is it a dream within a dream? Some dreams are short, waking up at daybreak. Some dreams are long, easily 100 years. When people die, they will wake up from the dream. There are also those who say they went to hell, or reincarnated, or worked like a cow or a horse. Who knows? I only know that in this dream world, you are dead. Don't mention those useless things to me. It is just shaking a person's beliefs in life. Because this is just a dream, it doesn't matter. Can you do whatever you want? Can you muddle through? People have to work hard to make progress. Higher status, more wealth, more women. Life is like this, and so is the dream world. Mu Bei laughed loudly. I know. Are you afraid that you will lose your current abilities when you wake up? Silly boy, you don't have to worry about this at all. The dream world will never impose an ability that does not belong to you. With your current ability, it means that you have a corresponding realm outside the dream. The sea rabbit didn't take him seriously. Any normal person, if someone told you that you were living in a dream and that everything was illusory, would you be willing to listen? If you were suffering, you might still deceive yourself when your life wasn't going your way. But if you were on the road to success and had the ability, your future would definitely be bright. You even had the benefits of a hot spring right now. Why would you believe it? It was only a possibility, but since he couldn't be sure, why not enjoy the dream first? Mu Bei secretly observed this guy's expression and was not in a hurry to succeed. In his countless years of dream transfer, he rarely met people who were aware of his current situation. There were very few people who were only suspicious but not sure. This little guy was such a person. He had doubts, but it was difficult to find evidence. So the best way was to enjoy the moment first. It was also a way to let nature take its course. In fact, Mu Bei himself was the real frequent visitor of the dream world. From one dream to another. For him, he could never jump out of the strange cycle of the dream world. He remembered a lot of things, but also forgot a lot of things. Every time he met a person who entered the dream world, as long as he liked them and had potential, he would not tire of telling them his story. The reason was very simple. As long as one of these people was awake or could remember the dream after going out, they would know who he was. Then it was possible for them to tell him when they came back again. As long as he knew who he was, he could jump out of the endless cycle of the dream world. This little guy had such potential. Even in the dream world, his own attributes made him stand out from the crowd. Even he, who was once an immortal, couldn't defeat him. It could be seen how strong his ability was outside. The most important thing was that this little guy had doubts in the depths of his heart. This was the best breakthrough. With such an opening, he could continue to tell stories, to hint and restore his consciousness in the future. The forest fox path was actually called the spirit fox immortal path in ancient times. Its spiritual energy was so strong that even immortals could get lost in it. That was why a special race like the heavenly fox was born. That was why the immortal court took special care and was on guard against the heavenly fox race. They didn't dare to let them stay here and develop into a powerful force that couldn't be ignored. Ancient beasts were not to be feared. All the beasts with strong bodies, born from the earth, and powerful abilities were not to be feared. The most frightening thing was that the beasts had the same growth potential as humans. In time, there would be no limit at all. Humans were a race that possessed unlimited growth potential and had no upper limit. They knew where their advantages were. So how could they tolerate the appearance of another race like this? Therefore, the mistake made by the heavenly fox was just a cover. Which race didn't make mistakes? This was especially true for humans. According to this standard, humans should have gone extinct a long time ago. As a lingering spirit, he had been trapped here for many years. He was so old that he could not even tell how old he was. He was not trapped here alone, but was constantly dragged into one dream after another by the energy of the deep forest path, treating him as a test for the outsiders. He had to admit that the ability of the forest fox path to create dreamlands was indeed shocking. Even immortals would be wary of it. Not only were there stories, there were scenes, characters, dynasties, and even people like him who could control the situation. The problem was that, because he entered the dreamlands so frequently, he had lost his sense of time. How many tens of thousands of years had it been? He didn't know. This was because half of his time was spent playing house with others in the dreamlands. What was a force user? Only the cultivators who were pulled into the dreamlands were force users. The characters created by the dreamlands would never have extraordinary powers. This was the truth of the dreamlands. The entire scenario was built by the forest fox path. It was like a haunted house. There were props and fake characters. There was also a storyline. The test was for the cultivators who were pulled into the dreamlands. If they were killed or fell into the sea, they would be expelled from the game. Therefore, he didn't lie to the sea hare. They really didn't die. They were just declared to have failed the test and lost the chance to enter the forest fox path again. He was one of the controllers. The other was the consciousness of the forest fox path. It was a dual controller. He had to let most people die here. Otherwise, how could the mysteries of the forest fox path be revealed? Chapter 2054. Mubei had forgotten many things. He knew that this was not a problem with his memory, but someone had done it on purpose. Who did it? Who else could it be other than himself? He only knew that he was once very powerful, very powerful. He was once ranked among the immortals. He had once forced his way to the lower realm. But what happened after that was not something he could see in his dream. He wanted to know. He wanted to know the changes in the outside world. He wanted to know who he was. He wanted to know if there was a chance for him to make a comeback. But his consciousness had sealed him at the last moment. That was a power he could not break free from. He could not do it on his own, so he could only rely on the help of others. He had no means in the dream. He could not bring anything out of the spiritual world, not to mention physical objects and letters. Even memories could not be brought out. He could only place his hopes on these outsiders, hoping that one of them would suddenly awaken his memories in this dream. That way, he would be able to obtain some information or create some suspense and memories that would leave a deep impression so that they could still vaguely remember it after leaving this place. He had been working hard on this, but after countless dreams, he had not succeeded. This was a spiritual phenomenon that even immortals would be wary of, and he was sealed by himself, an immortal. If he wanted to completely release himself, the difficulty was obvious. He could only try his luck in the long river of time. For example, this sea rabbit had a lot of potential. He could even guess that this guy's orthodoxy should be the same as his orthodoxy. He was sure because this could not be faked. When a sword attack began, that instinct could not be hidden. He could not hide it, but this sea rabbit was also undoubtedly exposed. What was left? He needed patience. Step by step, he had to wake this little guy up. Otherwise, with his status in the dreamlands, why would he fight with this little guy every day? Of course, the story had to be interesting. It had to be attractive. He was not afraid of the wrath of heaven, because this was all real, and he was just talking in his dream. The rulers of the heavens have 36 rules. The supreme rules, the rules that everyone must follow, not only humans, but also beasts and even ghosts. Also nature, the stars, the universe, all must follow these rules. Every rule is controlled by a great power. They're the Tao Lords. I am one of them, and I am a very important one. But now, I've forgotten which one I'm in charge of. The sea hare was confused. He still couldn't understand the deeper meaning of this. But Mubei's intention was not to let him understand it now, but to use this information to stimulate his memory retention. Every cultivator who entered this place would be captured by the spiritual energy of the spirit fox path. Without exception, even immortals would not be able to escape this calamity. Compared to the spiritual astronomical phenomenon that had existed proudly in the universe for millions of years, the human's spiritual energy was like a firefly compared to the sun and moon. The only difference was how long it would take for you to wake up. Normal cultivators would never be able to awaken from the dreamlands. Those who were proficient in the dreamlands might be able to do better, depending on their own abilities. Immortals would wake up very quickly, but this was only in theory, because no immortals would come here to look for trouble. Even if they fell into the dreamland for a short period of time, it would be an insult to them. Would this little guy wake up from his dream? When will he wake up? Or perhaps they would never wake up, but would retain a certain amount of memories of the dream after leaving. This was Mubei's purpose. There was no success rate to speak of. All he could do was to keep looking for people in different dreamlands, keep telling people his story, and pin his hopes on fate. The sea hare was very curious. Is it like the different food tycoons in the big market of the Moon Crescent Islands? Fish head, vegetable head, meat head, seasoning head, pickled vegetable head, dry goods head, dung head. Each has its own rules. Each has its own territory. Mubei was speechless. If you were to talk to a mortal about the rules of heaven and the great Tao, you would have to face such a dilemma. They would use the easiest way to understand the analogy. It was very vulgar, and the scope was so small that it was unbearable to look at. But this was a normal phenomenon. Mubei was not angry at all, because he had heard too many of such metaphors. Comparing the market to the brothel was still good. Well, in a sense, you can understand it like this. But you can put your own structure bigger. The sea hare was very smart. Then, the food market of the central region. It was no wonder that he would not let go of the food market. Before he was 10 years old, as an orphan, he relied on the food market to survive. He had a special affection for that place, and it was comparable to his feelings for the sea. Mubei was depressed in his heart, but he was still neither fast nor slow. Well, a little bigger. Not only the food market, but also other industries. Any industry you can think of. The sea hare's thirst for knowledge was very strong. In the sky. Is there a food market in the sky? Mubei was unable to explain, because this would involve a series of problems. Not to mention 3 days and 3 nights. Even 3 years would not be enough to explain to a mortal. So his experience was, don't explain, go with the flow. Otherwise, sooner or later, he would be driven crazy by the pace of this conversation. There is, but it is not called a food market. The people in the sky, what they eat is not the same as mortals. They will refine all the ingredients together and make something like a pill. So it is very clean. There will not be rotten leaves, internal organs, blood, and feces everywhere. The sea hare suddenly realized. So it's like this. I have eaten pills before. It is not delicious. It does not taste good. Also, can this thing be eaten? Mubei decided to return to the main topic as soon as possible. Otherwise, if he continued to explain, sooner or later, he would fall into a ditch. All right, it is roughly like a food market. Then, since you're familiar with the food market, then these so-called leaders, they're all colluding with each other, right? The sea hare slapped her thigh. Of course. They must be colluding with each other. Otherwise, how can they manipulate the market price? And every once in a while, there will always be a product that will suddenly increase in price. They would rather leave the goods rotting in the warehouse to earn a high profit. This year, you are ruthless. Next year, you are the army. Then you're the money. Next time, you are the bean. You play? It is all like this. If they're not coordinated, how can these profiteers make money? Mubei nodded. It is also like this in the sky. 36 rules, 36 paths. Every once in a while, there will always be a path that is abnormally difficult to traverse. It requires extra resources, extra effort, and extra threshold. But they're not doing it for money, but to prove that the great path is difficult, even if they do not understand it. Only then can they have such control, and in this control, form all kinds of small circles for themselves, controlling the door to advance. These are all common decisions. At the very least, it is the mainstream decision. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.